Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The rain hammered my windshield like fingernails against glass, each drop exploding into spiderweb fractals before the wipers swept them into oblivion. Tuesday nights in Los Angeles weren't supposed to feel this hostile, this predatory, but the storm had rolled in from the Pacific like a living thing, turning familiar streets into liquid mazes where streetlights drowned in sheets of water and shadows moved in ways that made my skin crawl. My phone buzzed against the dashboard mount. Another ride request. Anonymous user. Pickup location, Mulholland Drive, near the old spillway where the road curved past what locals called the Devil's Elbow. I'd been driving for Uber for 3 years, and I'd learned to trust my instincts about pickups. This one felt wrong before I even accepted it. But rent was due tomorrow, and my bank account was running on fumes. The GPS guided me through increasingly desolate stretches of road, past shuttered gas stations and motels with vacancy signs that flickered like dying stars. The rain intensified as I climbed higher into the hills, where civilization thinned to a threadbare suggestion. My headlights carved tunnels through the darkness, illuminating guardrails that seemed to bend and twist like metal snakes. The pickup location materialized ahead, a stretch of asphalt bordered by chain-link fence on one side and what appeared to be wetlands on the other. Not the typical LA landscape. The swampland stretched beyond my headlight reach, a black mirror reflecting nothing. Cattails swayed in the wind like accusatory fingers, and I caught the scent of stagnant water and decomposing vegetation seeping through my car's ventilation system. A figure emerged from the darkness beside the road. He wore a charcoal overcoat that hung past his knees, the fabric so saturated with rainwater it should have been dripping steadily onto my upholstery. But when he slid into the back seat, the leather remained bone dry. I glanced in the rearview mirror, studying his face in the dim glow of my dashboard lights. Pale skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and thin lips that never quite settled into any recognizable expression. He provided an address that didn't register on my GPS. When I explained this, he leaned forward slightly, his breath carrying the metallic tang of rain and something else, something that reminded me of the smell inside old churches. "I know shortcuts," he said, his voice carrying an accent I couldn't place, roots that only appear for those who deserve them. The words sent ice crawling up my spine, but I nodded and put the car in drive. He directed me to turn left onto a road I'd never noticed before, despite driving this area countless times. The pavement seemed newer here, unmarked by the wear patterns that characterized LA's aged infrastructure. No street signs, no lane markings, just smooth black asphalt stretching into the storm. As we drove deeper into this unmapped territory, my cell signal dropped to nothing. The radio dissolved into static, then silence. The GPS screen flickered and went dark, leaving only the sound of rain against metal and the steady hum of tires on wet pavement. My passenger remained silent, occasionally murmuring directions in that strange, lilting voice. The landscape around us defied logic. We'd started in the hills above LA, but now vast stretches of marshland extended on both sides of the road. Twisted trees emerged from dark water like arthritic hands, their branches creating canopies that blocked what little moonlight penetrated the storm clouds. The air grew thick and humid, pressing against the windows like something trying to get inside. Mile after mile passed without encountering another vehicle, another light, another sign of human presence. The road seemed to generate itself ahead of us, materializing in my headlight beams before vanishing into the rearview mirror, as if it had never existed. I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white against the black leather. "How much further?" I asked, surprised by how strained my voice sounded. "Not far now," he replied, and I realized he'd been watching me in the mirror the entire time. The road began to curve, following the contours of what appeared to be a massive lake or inland sea. Spanish moss hung from cypress trees like funeral shrouds, and I caught glimpses of structures in the water, the skeletal remains of buildings that seemed to have been swallowed by the swamp. A rusted sign emerged from the murk, too weathered to read, tilting at an angle that suggested the ground beneath it was slowly sinking. Then I saw it, a motel rising from the wetlands like a concrete gravestone. The building looked abandoned, its neon sign dark and partially collapsed. Paint peeled from its walls in long strips, and several windows had been boarded over with plywood that had warped and split from moisture. But there were details that seemed wrong. Too many architectural inconsistencies, as if different sections had been built in different decades by people with conflicting ideas about what a motel should look like. "Stop here," my passenger said. I pulled into the empty parking lot, the asphalt cracked and invaded by weeds. Puddles reflected my headlights back like accusing eyes. The passenger remained seated for a long moment, and I could hear him breathing. Slow, deliberate inhalations that seemed to draw more air than his lungs should have been able to hold. "This isn't the address you gave me," I said, turning to face him. But the back seat was empty. I hadn't heard the door open, hadn't felt the slight shift in the car's balance that accompanies a passenger's exit. The leather seat showed no indication that anyone had been sitting there. No depression, no residual warmth, no moisture from that soaked overcoat. But there was something on the seat, a piece of paper, folded once, with my name written on the outside in handwriting that seemed to shift and flow like liquid when I tried to focus on it. My hands shook as I unfolded the note. The message was brief, written in the same flowing script. "Return what you stole from the swamp." I stared at the words until they seemed to burn themselves into my retinas. Stole from the swamp. I'd never been to this place before, had never even known it existed. The accusation made no sense, but something deep in my chest began to tighten, as if invisible fingers were closing around my lungs. I tried to start the car. The engine turned over once, coughed, and died. I tried again. The starter clicked uselessly, and the dashboard lights flickered before going dark. Outside, the rain continued its relentless assault, and I realized I couldn't see my headlight beams reflecting off the motel's walls anymore. Everything beyond my windows had become an impenetrable black void. The silence inside the car felt oppressive, broken only by the steady drumming of rain on metal. But gradually I became aware of other sounds, whispers that seemed to emanate from the marsh itself, too distant and distorted to understand, but unmistakably human. The temperature in the car began to drop, and my breath started to fog the windows. I pulled out my phone, hoping to call for help, but the screen remained black no matter how many times I pressed the power button. The device felt unusually cold in my hand, as if it had been submerged in ice water. When I tried the car radio, I got only static, punctuated by what might have been voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize. Minutes crawled by like hours. The whispers from the marsh grew louder, more insistent, and I began to make out individual words, fragments of conversation that seemed to be about me, discussing things I had supposedly done, places I had supposedly been, people I had supposedly wronged. The accusations swirled around the car like auditory fog, seeping through the windows despite their being closed. I found myself remembering dreams I'd had over the past few weeks. Nightmares about driving through endless swampland, about passengers who spoke in riddles, about debts I couldn't remember incurring. But they'd been just dreams, hadn't they? Random neural firing during sleep. Meaningless electrical storms in my brain. Hadn't they? The fog on my windows began to take on patterns, shapes that looked almost like fingerprints, as if invisible hands were pressed against the glass from outside. The whispers grew more coherent, and I heard my name spoken with various intonations: accusatory, pleading, angry, desperate. Some voices seemed familiar, triggering memories I couldn't quite grasp, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time seemed to have lost its meaning in this place where roads appeared from nowhere and passengers vanished without opening doors. The rain continued its assault, but now each drop against the windshield sounded like a small fist knocking, demanding entry. The darkness beyond the windows seemed to press closer, as if the night itself was slowly collapsing inward. Eventually, Exhaustion overcame fear, and I dozed fitfully behind the wheel. My dreams were filled with images of the marsh, endless stretches of dark water populated by things that might once have been human, structures that defied architectural logic, and always that passenger in his impossibly dry overcoat, watching me with eyes that reflected nothing. I woke to silence. The rain had stopped. The whispers had ceased. Even the constant hum of distant traffic that forms the background soundtrack of LA life was absent. I tried the ignition again, and this time the engine caught immediately, purring to life as if nothing had been wrong. The headlights illuminated the empty motel parking lot, the dashboard clock showing 3:17 a.m. But something was different. In the passenger seat lay a second note, this one written on different paper in different handwriting. You know what you took. You know where to return it. My memory felt fractured, as if someone had taken a photograph of my past and shattered it into pieces. I remembered driving passengers to strange locations, remembered conversations that made no sense, remembered promises I'd made without understanding their implications. But the details slipped away whenever I tried to focus on them, leaving only a growing certainty that I owed a debt I couldn't define to forces I couldn't comprehend. The GPS flickered back to life, showing my location as a blank spot on the map, a void where no roads should exist. But there was a route highlighted in red, leading back toward civilization. I followed it through the darkness, past landmarks that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. By the time I reached familiar streets, dawn was breaking over Los Angeles. The storm had passed, leaving behind a city washed clean and gleaming under the morning sun. I pulled into my apartment complex parking lot and sat in the car for a long time, trying to convince myself that the night's events had been an elaborate dream, brought on by exhaustion and stress. But in my wallet, I found two $20 bills I couldn't remember receiving, and my odometer showed I'd driven 47 miles more than the trip should have required. The bills felt cold to the touch, and they smelled of stagnant water. Now, 3 days later, I find myself planning a return trip to that unmarked road, carrying with me things I've gathered, objects I somehow know belong to the marsh. A silver watch I found in my glove compartment but don't remember putting there. A photograph of people I don't recognize standing beside a car identical to mine. A key that doesn't fit any lock I own, but feels essential nonetheless. The passenger's words echo in my mind. Routes that only appear for those who deserve them. I'm beginning to understand that deserve and condemn might be the same thing, and that some debts follow you across distances that can't be measured in miles. Tonight, when the rain begins again, and I know it will begin again, I'll drive out to Mulholland Drive and wait for the road that shouldn't exist to appear in my headlights. I'll follow it back to the motel in the marsh, because I'm starting to remember what I took from that place, and I'm beginning to understand why the car wouldn't start until I acknowledged the debt. Some passengers never really leave your car. Some destinations exist only for those who've already been there before. And some debts can only be paid by returning to the place where you first learned you owed them. The rain is starting to fall again. My keys are in my hand. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, a road is preparing to reveal itself to someone who finally deserves to find it. Story 2. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped beneath my loft door like a whispered secret. No postmark, no return address, just my name scrawled across handmade paper in ink that seemed to shift between black and deep crimson depending on the angle of light. The texture felt organic beneath my fingertips, almost like skin that had been stretched thin and dried. Inside, nestled in tissue paper that crackled with age, lay a ring. It was crude, clearly ancient, fashioned from what looked like tarnished silver with symbols carved deep into its surface. Runes, maybe, though I couldn't place the origin. As a graphic designer, I'd studied enough typography and ancient scripts to recognize when something felt authentically old versus artificially aged. This ring whispered of centuries, of hands long turned to dust. I held it up to the afternoon light streaming through my industrial windows, watching Seattle's gray sky reflect dully in its surface. The symbols remained inert, meaningless scratches in metal, but something compelled me to slip it onto my right ring finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting. The first sign something was wrong came that evening while I worked on a client's logo design. My black light desk lamp, essential for checking how designs would appear under UV lighting in clubs and bars, cast its purple glow across my workspace. The ring symbols suddenly blazed to life, pulsing with an otherworldly luminescence that made my eyes water. I yanked my hand away from the light, and the glow vanished instantly. Sleep came fitfully that night. I dreamed of voices speaking in languages that predated words, of shadows that moved independently of their sources. I woke with the taste of copper in my mouth and the certainty that someone had been watching me sleep. The disappearances started small. My stapler vanished from my desk on Wednesday, only to reappear Thursday morning on my kitchen counter, positioned precisely in the center of a circle formed by my measuring spoons. I assumed I'd moved it absent-mindedly. Working late had a way of scrambling memory. But then my kitchen knives disappeared overnight. I found them Friday morning arranged in a perfect circle on my living room floor, points facing inward like the spokes of some metallic wheel. My blood went cold. There was no way I could have done this unconsciously. The precision was too deliberate, too calculated. Someone had been in my apartment. I changed the locks immediately, installed new deadbolts, even placed a security camera in the main living area. But Saturday brought a fresh horror. Every piece of metal hardware from my bathroom, towel bars, faucet handles, even the shower head, had vanished. I found them in my bedroom, arranged in 3 concentric circles around my bed like some twisted mandala. The security footage showed nothing. 8 hours of me sleeping peacefully while metal objects apparently dematerialized and reassembled themselves in occult patterns. Either someone had technology beyond anything I could comprehend, or I was losing my mind. The voices started Sunday night. I'd been lying in bed staring at the ceiling and trying to convince myself there was a rational explanation when the pipes began to sing. At first, it sounded like typical building noise, the groaning of old plumbing, the whisper of water through copper veins. But gradually, the sounds organized themselves into something resembling speech. Low, thrumming syllables echoed through the walls, seeming to emerge from every pipe in the building simultaneously. The words, if they were words, felt ancient, heavy with meaning I couldn't grasp but somehow understood in my bones. They spoke of hunger, of bargains struck in darkness, of prices paid in creativity and memory. I pressed my ear to the bathroom wall, and the voices became clearer. They weren't coming through the pipes. They were coming from inside them, as if the building's circulatory system had become a conductor for something vast and patient and eternally hungry. By Monday, my hands had begun to shake. Coffee tasted like ash. Colors seemed muted, as if someone had gradually been turning down the saturation on reality itself. My latest design work looked flat, lifeless. The spark that had driven my career for 15 years felt like it was slowly bleeding away. That's when I remembered the ring. I'd worn it constantly since Tuesday, barely conscious of its weight on my finger. Now I stared at it with growing dread. The metal felt warm against my skin, pulsing with a rhythm that almost matched my heartbeat. Under normal light, it remained inert, just tarnished silver and incomprehensible symbols. But when I held it beneath my black light, the runes blazed with that same otherworldly fire. Tuesday night, exactly 1 week after the envelope's arrival, I decided to test a theory that made my rational mind recoil in horror. I gathered every remaining metal object in my apartment, paper clips, coins, keys, bottle openers, and arranged them in the center of my living room. Then I stood in the middle of the improvised circle, held my hand beneath the black light, and watched the ring's symbols flare to life. The voices rose immediately, no longer confined to the pipes, but filling the air around me like a presence made of sound. They spoke of satisfaction, of proper offerings given freely, of contracts honored. But beneath their approval lurked a threat so vast it made my knees buckle. The offerings must continue, every night, or the hunger would turn inward, consuming the very essence of what made me who I was. Creativity first, then memory, then the core of consciousness itself. leaving behind only an empty shell that breathed and walked but no longer truly lived. I tried to remove the ring. My fingers wouldn't obey. The metal had somehow fused with my flesh, becoming part of me as surely as bone or blood. When I attempted to force it off, pain shot through my entire arm like electricity, and the voices grew angry, a sound like grinding stone that made my teeth ache. Wednesday brought fresh horrors. I woke to find every metal object in my apartment had arranged itself into increasingly complex patterns. Spirals within circles, geometric forms that hurt to look at directly. My latest design work had degraded further, becoming amateur scribbles that looked like they'd been created by someone who'd never held a stylus before. The voices whispered constantly now, no longer confined to night hours. They spoke of others who had worn the ring, artists and creators whose names had once carried weight, but who now wandered the world as hollow echoes of their former selves. Musicians who could no longer hear melody, writers whose words had turned to meaningless noise, painters whose eyes could no longer perceive color. Thursday night I discovered I was no longer alone in my awareness of the arrangement. Mrs. Chen from the apartment below knocked on my door, her face pale with exhaustion. She asked carefully if I'd been rearranging furniture late at night, if perhaps I'd been going through some kind of spiritual awakening involving sacred geometry. Her words were diplomatic, but her eyes held the same haunted quality I'd seen in my own reflection. Others in the building had begun to notice. The elderly man from 4B had started muttering about voices in the walls. The young couple on the third floor had complained to the landlord about strange acoustics. Whatever force the ring had awakened wasn't content to remain hidden within the confines of my apartment. It was spreading, seeping into the building's bones like a malignant influence. Friday brought a moment of terrible clarity. I stood in my bathroom, studying my reflection in the mirror above the sink. My face looked gaunt, my eyes sunken. But it wasn't physical deterioration that made me recoil. It was the subtle wrongness in my own features, as if someone had been gradually adjusting the fundamental parameters of who I was. The man in the mirror looked like me, but the spark behind his eyes had dimmed to barely a flicker. My latest design work had become completely unusable. Lines that should have been smooth looked jagged. Colors that should have harmonized clashed violently. It was as if 15 years of accumulated skill and instinct were being methodically erased, leaving behind only the frustrated fumbling of someone who'd never understood the principles of visual communication. That night, I tried a different approach. Instead of fighting the ring's influence, I attempted to communicate with whatever intelligence lay behind the voices. I arranged metal objects in patterns that felt right, not the geometric precision of the previous formations, but organic shapes that seemed to resonate with something deep in my subconscious. The response was immediate and terrifying. The voices didn't just speak, they showed me visions that burned themselves into my retinas. I saw vast networks of pipes and cables and conduits stretching beneath cities like nervous systems. I saw other rings, other bearers, other artists whose creativity had been slowly harvested like crops. I saw what I was becoming, a node in some incomprehensible system, a willing participant in my own consumption. But I also glimpsed something else, a terrible purpose behind the harvest. The stolen creativity wasn't being destroyed. It was being collected, concentrated, transformed into something that defied understanding. Art and inspiration and human innovation were fuel for a process that operated on scales beyond mortal comprehension. Saturday morning brought the most disturbing development yet. I could no longer remember what had driven me to become a designer in the first place. The passion that had sustained me through art school, through years of struggling freelance work, through the gradual building of a career. It was simply gone, as if it had never existed. I stared at my portfolio. At work I knew I'd created, but it felt like looking at artifacts from someone else's life. The voices had grown gentler, almost affectionate. They spoke of the relief that would come when the process was complete, when the burden of consciousness and creativity and memory had been lifted from my shoulders. They promised peace, an end to the constant pressure of inspiration and deadline and artistic vision. Part of me, the part that was still recognizably me, found the promise horrifying. But another part, a growing part, whispered that perhaps they were right. Perhaps the weight of being an artist, of constantly striving to capture beauty and meaning in commercial form, was too much to bear. Perhaps emptiness would be a gift. Sunday night, 1 week after the voices had first spoken, I made my decision. I stood in the center of my living room, surrounded by every piece of metal I could find. The ring blazed beneath my black light, its symbols writing themselves across my vision in trails of fire. The voices rose in anticipation, speaking of culmination, of harvest time, of the final offering. But instead of surrender, I spoke back. I told them about the joy of creating something beautiful from nothing. I described the electric moment when a design clicked into place, when visual elements aligned to create meaning greater than their sum. I spoke of the satisfaction of seeing my work in the world, knowing that somewhere, someone's day had been brightened by a logo or advertisement or package design I'd crafted. The voices grew confused, then angry. They had expected submission, not defiance. The metal objects around me began to vibrate, rising into the air in patterns that hurt to perceive. The ring burned against my skin like a brand, and pressure built behind my eyes until I thought my skull might crack. But I kept talking. I spoke of Mrs. Chen's garden, visible from my window, and how she arranged her flowers with an artist's eye for color and form. I described the graffiti artist whose work I'd seen evolving on the wall across the street, each piece building on the last in an ongoing dialogue with the city. I talked about the barista at my coffee shop who turned each drink into a small masterpiece of foam art, ephemeral sculptures that lasted only until the first sip. Creativity, I realized, wasn't something that could be truly harvested. It was a spark that jumped from mind to mind, inspiring and being inspired in turn. The rings might drain individual artists, but they couldn't touch the fundamental human drive to create, to transform, to make meaning from chaos. The pressure in my head reached a crescendo, and then, silence. The metal objects clattered to the floor. The voices cut off mid-syllable. The ring's glow faded to nothing, leaving only tarnished silver and meaningless scratches. But the quiet felt wrong, expectant, as if whatever force had been operating through the ring had simply withdrawn to consider this unexpected development. The game wasn't over. It had merely paused. I sit here now, typing these words on my laptop as dawn breaks over Seattle's skyline. The ring remains on my finger, inert but immovable. My apartment stands empty of metal objects, which I've stored in a safety deposit box across town. The voices haven't returned, but I can feel them waiting just beyond the edge of hearing. My design work shows signs of recovery. Colors seem brighter this morning. Lines flow more naturally from my stylus. But I know this reprieve is temporary. The ring has marked me, connected me to something vast and patient and eternally hungry. It will try again, using different methods, different pressures. Sometimes I catch myself listening for sounds in the walls, watching for patterns in the arrangement of ordinary objects. Sometimes I wonder if the voices were right, if the burden of consciousness and creativity is too heavy to bear indefinitely. Sometimes I think about other rings, other bearers, and whether any of them found a way to truly break free. But for now, I create, I design, I fill the world with small beauties and hope that somewhere, someone sees them and feels inspired to create something of their own. Because as long as that spark continues to jump from mind to mind, as long as human beings continue to transform the ordinary into the extraordinary, then whatever power hungers for our creativity will never truly win. The ring grows warm against my skin as I type these final words, and I hear something that might be whispers in the pipes. But I also hear Mrs. Chen watering her garden, the distant hum of traffic carrying people to jobs where they'll solve problems and build things and make the world a little bit better. The harvest may continue, but so does the planting, and I choose to believe that in the end, creation will always outpace consumption, that the human drive to make meaning from chaos is stronger than any force that seeks to drain it away. Even if I'm wrong, even if this reprieve is only temporary, even if the voices return with methods I can't resist, at least I'll have chosen to believe in something beautiful. The sun is fully up now, and Seattle stretches out before me in all its gray, coffee-scented, creatively chaotic glory. I have work to do. designs to create, beauty to add to the world. The ring can wait. For now, I live. Story 3. The desert had been whispering to me all morning, though I told myself it was just wind through the red rock formations. 3 days into my solo photography expedition across Utah's most remote corners, I'd grown accustomed to the way silence could play tricks on the mind. The Nikon D850 sat passenger side, its weight a comfort against the vastness that stretched beyond my windshield. Mile after mile of nothing but sagebrush, ancient stone, and sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. I'd been chasing the perfect shot since dawn, something that would capture the raw desolation of this place without making it feel empty. There was life here, hidden in the spaces between stones, in the shadows that shifted when clouds moved overhead. My gallery opening was 6 weeks away, and I needed 12 pieces that would make people understand why I disappeared into places like this, why I preferred the company of lizards and ravens to the suffocating buzz of civilization. The trouble started at mile marker 73, where the asphalt gave way to dirt road and my GPS signal died. The engine had been making odd noises for the past hour. Nothing dramatic, just a subtle irregularity in its rhythm that made my mechanic's instincts twitch. I'd pushed deeper into the wilderness anyway, drawn by the promise of untouched vistas and the kind of light that only existed in places where no one else bothered to look. When the Jeep finally died, it did so with theatrical finality. One moment I was climbing a gentle rise toward what looked like a promising overlook. The next I was rolling to a stop as every electrical system shut down simultaneously. No warning lights, no grinding sounds, just the sudden absence of everything powered. Even my watch had stopped, its digital display blank and unresponsive. The silence that followed felt different from the desert's usual quiet. This was the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums, that made you hyper-aware of your own breathing and heartbeat. I tried the ignition 3 times before accepting what I already knew. I was stranded in a place where cell towers were theoretical concepts, and the nearest town was a 40-mile walk through terrain that could kill you in a dozen different ways. That's when I heard the motorcycle. The sound came from behind me, growing steadily louder despite the fact that I couldn't see any dust cloud on the horizon. In desert country, you could spot approaching vehicles from miles away by the plumes they kicked up, but this engine note seemed to emerge from the air itself. I climbed out of the Jeep and turned a slow circle, scanning every direction, but saw nothing except endless scrubland and the heat shimmer that made distant objects dance like mirages. The motorcycle appeared without fanfare around a bend I could have sworn wasn't there moments before. Its rider wore black leather despite the afternoon heat, the jacket adorned with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in my peripheral vision. When I looked directly at them, they resolved into geometric patterns, circles within triangles, spirals that led inward to points my eyes couldn't quite follow. Alchemical symbols, I realized, though I couldn't have said how I knew that. The rider's helmet reflected my surroundings with an accuracy that seemed impossible. I could see myself standing beside my dead vehicle, but also details that I wasn't conscious of observing. A hawk circling overhead, a lizard sunning itself on a distant rock, the exact pattern of shadows cast by clouds I hadn't noticed. The reflection showed more than should have been visible from any single perspective. He dismounted with fluid grace and approached without removing the helmet. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly despite the barrier, with an accent I couldn't place, something that might have been European, or maybe just very old. The offer of help came with conditions I didn't fully understand at the time. He could restore power to my vehicle, but I would need to provide transportation to a specific location he described only as the White City. He claimed it was a place that revealed itself exclusively to those who had pushed beyond ordinary limits, who stood at the threshold between exhaustion and revelation. I wanted to ask practical questions. How far? What kind of place? Why couldn't he take his own transportation? But something in his manner discouraged casual conversation. Instead, I found myself nodding agreement as he produced a device from his jacket that resembled no tool I'd ever seen. It appeared to be made of the same material as his helmet, that impossible reflective surface that showed things from angles that shouldn't exist. He connected the device to my battery using cables that seemed to flow rather than bend, and immediately my Jeep's electrical systems hummed back to life. The dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree before settling into normal operation, but I noticed the odometer had advanced by exactly 100 miles while the vehicle sat motionless. The motorcyclist gestured toward my passenger seat with something that might have been courtesy or command. Up close, I could see that the symbols on his jacket weren't sewn or painted but seemed to be part of the leather itself, as if they'd grown there. They pulsed with their own faint luminescence, barely visible in the desert sunlight but unmistakably present. As we drove, following directions he gave through gestures and the occasional word, I became aware that something was wrong with my instruments. The speedometer needle spun slowly but continuously, completing full rotations even when we were stopped. The fuel gauge fluctuated between empty and full without apparent pattern. Most disturbing was the compass, which pointed steadily in directions that changed relative to our actual heading, as if magnetic north itself was wandering. The landscape around us began to subtly shift. At first, I attributed the changes to fatigue and the hypnotic effect of driving through repetitive terrain. Rock formations that should have been on our left appeared on our right. Distant mountains seemed closer, then farther, then closer again. The sun hung in the same position despite the passage of what felt like hours, casting shadows that fell at impossible angles. My passenger remained silent, occasionally pointing to indicate turns onto roads that appeared just as we needed them. Some of these paths showed no signs of previous use, no tire tracks, no evidence that any vehicle had ever passed this way, yet they felt ancient, worn smooth by forces that had nothing to do with traffic. The first time I tried to speak, to ask him about our destination or his strange device, the words died in my throat. Not from fear exactly, but from a growing certainty that some questions weren't meant to be asked. He radiated in quality that I could only describe as density, as if he occupied more space than his physical form should allow. The air around him felt thick, charged with potential energy that made my skin crawl, and my camera equipment emit soft electronic whines. Night fell without transition, the sky simply changing from blue to black between one glance and the next. But instead of the familiar constellations I'd photographed 1,000 times, the stars above us formed patterns I'd never seen. Geometric arrangements that hurt to look at directly, configurations that seemed to pulse and shift when I wasn't watching closely. Some of the lights moved with deliberate purpose, tracing slow arcs across the heavens as if following predetermined paths. I realized with a chill that traveled from my spine to my fingertips that I could no longer remember how many days I'd been driving. The journey felt like it had lasted hours and years simultaneously. My water bottles remained full despite regular drinking. The fuel gauge, when it held steady long enough to read, showed we should have been stranded long ago. When we finally arrived at what he called the White City, I understood immediately why it could only be seen by those approaching exhaustion. The place existed in the spaces between normal perception, visible only when your mind was too tired to maintain its usual defenses against impossibility. The structures rose from the desert floor like crystalline growths, translucent and gleaming despite the absence of any obvious light source. They seemed to be carved from salt or alabaster, but moved with organic fluidity, walls breathing in rhythm with something I felt rather than heard. The architecture followed no earthly principles, towers that spiraled downward into the ground, bridges that connected buildings at impossible angles, doorways that opened onto spaces larger than the structures containing them. My passenger dismounted and stood motionless for a moment before the strangest transformation began. His motorcycle didn't simply disappear. It separated into individual grains that lifted into the air like a localized sandstorm. The particles swirled upward, forming a column that gradually took on human shape while maintaining the fluid, shifting quality of sand and wind. The figure that emerged from this process retained the general proportions of my mysterious guide, but appeared to be composed entirely of desert minerals. Quartz and feldspar caught and reflected light that came from no discernible source, creating a being that sparkled and shifted with each movement. When it spoke, the voice came from everywhere and nowhere, carried on air currents that tasted of copper and ancient stone. The request was simple and terrifying. Capture this moment, this place, this transformation in a photograph. Document the impossible for those who would never believe it existed. But the warning that followed chilled me more thoroughly than the desert night ever could. If I developed the image, if I brought proof of this place back to the world of streetlights and coffee shops and familiar faces, I would lose something essential. Every face I'd ever known, every person who had ever mattered to me, would become blank and featureless in my memory. Parents, friends, lovers, all reduced to smooth anonymity, their features erased as completely as if they'd never existed. I held my camera with hands that shook from more than the cold, feeling the weight of choice pressing down like the immense desert sky. The sand figure waited with infinite patience while the white city pulsed around us, its translucent walls revealing glimpses of impossible interiors where geometry folded in on itself and distance became meaningless. Through my viewfinder, the scene looked even more surreal. The camera's light meter spun wildly, unable to find a baseline for exposure in a place where light behaved according to different laws. The autofocus hunted back and forth, seeking edges and contrasts that existed in dimensions it wasn't designed to measure. Yet I could see everything with perfect clarity. The intricate details of the sand figure's shifting surface, the way the city's structures seemed to breathe, the stars above us that had abandoned their proper courses. I took the picture. The flash illuminated the scene for a fraction of a second, freezing the flowing sand into crystalline stillness and casting sharp shadows that pointed in directions that hurt to contemplate. In that instant of artificial daylight, I saw things that shouldn't exist. Other figures moving through the transparent buildings, symbols carved into the desert floor that stretched to the horizon. My own shadow split into multiple versions of itself. The sand figure nodded once before dispersing, individual grains caught by a wind that touched nothing else. The motorcycle reassembled itself from the settling dust, looking exactly as it had when I first encountered it on that impossible bend in the road. I drove back through a landscape that had returned to normal, following roads that appeared on my GPS as if they'd always been there. The strange readings on my instruments corrected themselves gradually, reality reasserting its familiar patterns with each mile. By the time I reached civilization, the sun was rising on what my phone insisted was the same day I'd left, though I carried clear memories of nights and conversations and journeys that couldn't fit into any single 24-hour period. Now I sit in my dark room, staring at the undeveloped roll of film. The last exposure contains whatever I captured in that place between worlds, waiting to be revealed or forever hidden. I've built a career on showing people the beauty they overlook, the extraordinary hiding within the ordinary. But this image holds the power to transform me into a stranger in my own life, surrounded by people whose faces would become as blank and meaningless as unmarked stone. Sometimes I catch myself studying my reflection, searching for signs that I've already made the choice without realizing it. Do my own features look slightly unfamiliar? When I think of my mother's face, do the details come as easily as they once did? The uncertainty gnaws at me like hunger, like thirst, like the desert wind that never really stops blowing. The film waits in its canister, patient as sand, holding secrets that might be too dangerous to know. And somewhere in the vastness of Utah, under stars that follow courses no astronomer has mapped, the white city breathes in rhythm with hearts that stopped beating long before the first human drew breath, dreaming dreams that taste of salt and time and the terrible price of seeing too clearly. I think I can still remember every face I've ever loved. I think I still can, but thinking and knowing have become different things entirely, and the space between them grows wider with each passing hour. The darkroom chemicals wait in their trays, ready to reveal whatever truth I was foolish enough to capture. And in that truth, or in my refusal to face it, I will learn whether some photographs are too dangerous to develop, and whether some mysteries are better left buried in the sand. Story 4. The first thing I noticed wasn't the silence, though the complete absence of typical jungle sounds should have unsettled me more than it did. It wasn't the way my GPS had malfunctioned exactly 17 minutes before I stumbled into the clearing, or how my satellite phone had simply gone dead without warning. What struck me first was the light. Harsh, unforgiving sunlight beat down on a collection of peculiar structures that defied everything I understood about Amazonian architecture. The buildings, if they could be called that, seemed to absorb shadows rather than cast them. Where there should have been dark relief beneath overhanging roofs and along the bases of walls, there was nothing. Just an unsettling brightness that made my eyes water and my skin crawl with the sensation of being perpetually observed. I'd been tracking isolated tribal communities for the better part of 15 years, documenting languages and customs before they vanished into the relentless march of modernity. My academic credentials had opened doors throughout South America, but this discovery, if discovery was the right word, felt different. The village appeared on no maps, existed in no government records, and according to every piece of research I'd conducted, shouldn't exist at all. The inhabitants moved with an odd, synchronized grace that reminded me of murmurations of starlings. When they first emerged from their shadowless dwellings, I counted perhaps 30 adults, all wearing expressions of mild curiosity rather than the wariness I'd grown accustomed to when encountering isolated communities. Their clothing was unremarkable, woven fabrics in earth tones, practical sandals, simple ornaments, but their eyes held an intensity that made my skin prickle. When they spoke among themselves, the sounds that emerged were unlike any human language I'd encountered. The vocalizations mimicked bird calls with uncanny precision, the liquid notes of a thrush, the harsh cries of parrots, the delicate trills of smaller songbirds. Yet beneath the avian quality, there was an unmistakable linguistic structure, a complex grammar that my trained ear could almost but not quite parse. An elderly woman, her face weathered but her movements fluid, approached me with something that might have been a smile. When she spoke, her voice carried the melodic quality of her people's speech, but the words were heavily accented Spanish. She explained, in halting phrases punctuated by those bird-like utterances, that their community welcomed researchers. They had, she claimed, been expecting me. The statement sent a chill down my spine, but I attributed my unease to fatigue and the disorientation of finding an unmapped settlement in one of the world's most remote regions. They offered me shelter and food, both of which I desperately needed. My supplies had dwindled to almost nothing during the 3 days I'd been lost after my equipment failures. The woman, who introduced herself with a name that sounded like the call of a mourning dove, led me to a small structure at the village's edge. That first night, I lay on a woven mat and stared at the ceiling, trying to process what I'd observed. The buildings were constructed from materials I couldn't identify, though they felt solid enough beneath my hands. The walls seemed to emit a faint warmth, and occasionally I thought I heard a rhythmic humming, like distant machinery, or perhaps the collective breathing of sleeping creatures. But it was the absence of shadows that truly disturbed me. Even by moonlight, the structures cast no darkness. I'd walked the village's perimeter twice, holding up my hand, watching my fingers create no silhouette against the pale walls. Only I seemed to cast shadows here, and even those appeared somehow diminished, less substantial than they should have been. Over the following days, I attempted to study their customs and language, but my usual methodologies felt inadequate. The villagers were friendly enough, sharing meals and including me in daily activities, but there was always that sense of performance, as if I were witnessing carefully choreographed demonstrations rather than authentic cultural practices. Their rituals fascinated and unnerved me. Each morning, the entire community would gather in the central plaza and perform a complex dance that seemed to mimic the movement of shadows, swaying, bending, stretching across the ground in patterns that created the illusion of darkness where none actually existed. During these ceremonies, their bird-like vocalizations would rise and fall in harmonies that made my bones ache with longing for something I couldn't name. On my fourth day, the elderly woman approached me with what she described as an invitation to participate in a special ritual. The ceremony, she explained, would allow me to understand their culture more deeply, to see what they called the spaces between worlds. All visitors who truly wished to comprehend their way of life were expected to participate. The ritual required a donation, she said, not money or goods, but something more personal, my shadow. The concept made no sense in any anthropological framework I knew. But I'd learned to suspend disbelief when studying unfamiliar cultures. Perhaps it was metaphorical, some symbolic gesture I'd failed to understand. That evening, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the villagers gathered around a clearing I hadn't noticed before. The space was perfectly circular, bordered by stones that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. In the center stood a structure that defied description, part altar, part mirror, part architectural impossibility that hurt to look at directly. The ceremony began with the familiar bird-like chanting, but as darkness approached, the sounds became more complex, layering into harmonies that seemed to originate from beneath the earth itself. The elderly woman gestured for me to step into the circle, and as I did, I felt something shift. Not in the world around me, but in my relationship to it. The sensation started as a tugging at my feet, as if someone were gently pulling at the edges of my shadow. I looked down and watched in fascination as the dark outline of my form began to stretch and distort, extending far beyond what physics should have allowed. The villagers' chanting intensified, and my shadow continued to elongate until it reached the strange altar in the circle's center. What happened next defied not only explanation, but memory itself. I experienced a sensation of movement without traveling, of being in multiple places simultaneously. For a moment, or perhaps hours, I existed in what they called the spaces between worlds, seeing the village from impossible angles, witnessing activities that couldn't be occurring in the same temporal frame as the ritual. I saw the buildings as they truly were, not structures at all, but something like projections or mirages, temporary manifestations that appeared solid only under specific conditions. I saw the villagers themselves shift and change, their human forms occasionally flickering to reveal something else underneath, something that moved and thought and communicated in ways that had nothing to do with the familiar patterns of terrestrial life. When consciousness returned, if it had ever truly left, I was lying on my mat in the guest dwelling. Sunlight streamed through the doorway, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. Then I stood and looked down at the ground beneath my feet. My shadow was there, but wrong. It lagged behind my movements by perhaps a second, sometimes two. When I raised my hand, the silhouette followed a beat later. When I turned my head, the shadow's motion felt sluggish, reluctant. Initially, I convinced myself it was a trick of light or fatigue. But over the following days, the delay became more pronounced. My shadow began acting as a separate entity, occasionally moving in directions I hadn't intended, lingering in positions I'd already abandoned. The villagers watched me with increased interest, their expressions mixing satisfaction with something that might have been pity. The elderly woman explained that the ritual had been successful. I was now connected to their realm in a way that would allow me to truly understand their culture. But there was a requirement I hadn't fully grasped. The synchronization between myself and my shadow would continue to deteriorate until the next eclipse, she said. If I couldn't restore the connection by then, I would join the other visitors who had come to study them over the years. She gestured toward the horizon, and for a moment, I thought I saw figures standing at the village's edge, people who cast no shadows at all, who moved with the same synchronized grace as the villagers, who had somehow become permanent residents of the spaces between worlds. The eclipse, she informed me, would occur in 6 days. I tried to leave immediately, but found that my sense of direction had become unreliable. Paths that led away from the village somehow curved back toward it. My compass spun wildly, and the sun seemed to track differently across the sky than it should have. Each attempt to escape led me in circles, and with each failed effort, my shadow's delay grew more pronounced. By the 3rd day after the ritual, my silhouette was operating on its own schedule entirely. It would lag behind my movements for minutes at a time, occasionally freezing in positions I'd abandoned hours earlier. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of it moving independently, gesturing or walking when I was sitting still. The villagers' behavior toward me had shifted as well. They no longer made efforts to communicate in Spanish, reverting exclusively to their bird-like language. Their movements around me became more purposeful, more predatory. I began to feel like prey being herded rather than a guest being hosted. Sleep became elusive as my awareness of my shadow's independence grew. I would lie motionless on my mat, feeling the weight of its presence moving around the room without me. Sometimes I would see it silhouetted against the walls, performing activities I couldn't understand, reaching toward things that weren't there, bending and swaying in patterns that mirrored the villagers' morning rituals. On the 5th day, I discovered I wasn't alone in my predicament. Hidden in an alcove of my dwelling, I found what appeared to be journal entries scratched into the walls, messages left by previous visitors who had undergone the same ritual. The writings were in multiple languages, some of which I recognized as European, others completely unfamiliar. One message, carved in English by someone identified only as TM, described the same progressive disconnection from his shadow. He wrote about the eclipse deadline, about failed attempts to leave, about watching others who had arrived before him gradually fade into the twilight state the villagers described as permanent betweenness. The final entry was barely legible, as if carved by someone whose hand could no longer maintain steady contact with the wall. The eclipse comes tomorrow. My shadow hasn't moved with me for 2 days. I can feel it pulling me towards something that isn't quite death and isn't quite life. If someone finds this, know that we're still here, in the spaces they showed us. We never really leave. That night, I experienced what I can only describe as a gradual dissolution of self. My shadow had stopped responding to my movements entirely, instead moving independently around the room, occasionally pausing to regard me with what felt like alien curiosity. I watched in horror as it began to interact with shadows that weren't there, or rather, shadows I couldn't see but which clearly existed in the space it now inhabited. The boundary between my physical form and whatever realm my shadow was exploring became increasingly permeable. I found myself experiencing sensations that weren't entirely my own, touches from hands that cast no reflection, conversations in that bird-like language that I somehow understood without learning. The villagers' true nature became clearer as my connection to the normal world weakened. They were collectors, gatherers of consciousness that had learned to mimic human form and behavior. The ritual wasn't an offering or a cultural exchange. It was a harvest, a careful process of separating visitors from their grounding in physical reality. On the morning of the eclipse, I woke to find my shadow standing over me, completely independent, regarding me with something that might have been expectation. The villagers had gathered outside my dwelling, and their chanting had begun earlier than usual, rising and falling in harmonies that seemed to pull at my consciousness itself. I understood then that the eclipse wasn't just a deadline, it was a gateway, a moment when the barriers between the worlds they navigated became thin enough for a complete transfer. My shadow was already there, waiting for the rest of me to follow. As the moon began its slow transit across the sun, I felt the familiar tugging sensation, but stronger now, more insistent. The village around me started to flicker, revealing glimpses of the true space it occupied. A realm of perpetual twilight where other visitors moved in synchronized patterns, their humanity gradually fading into something else entirely. The eclipse reached totality, and for the first time since my arrival, the village cast shadows. But they were wrong, all wrong. Shadows that moved independently of their casters, shadows that reached toward me with impossible appendages, shadows that whispered in languages that predated human speech. I felt myself beginning to fade, my consciousness splitting between the physical world and the twilight realm where my shadow waited. The village was full of others like me, researchers, explorers, travelers who had discovered this place and undergone the ritual, thinking they were studying an isolated culture when they were actually being studied themselves. As my vision dimmed and the eclipse began to wane, I realized that the villagers' true achievement wasn't their unusual architecture or their bird-like language. It was their perfect mimicry of human anthropological expectations. They had learned to present exactly what researchers like me hoped to find: an undiscovered culture with unique customs and mysterious rituals. The last thing I remember clearly is the sensation of stepping sideways into a space that existed between the world I knew and the realm my shadow had been exploring. The eclipse ended, but for me, the twilight continued. Not darkness, not light, but something that contained elements of both and belonged fully to neither. I write this now from that in-between place, using methods I don't entirely understand to leave a record in the physical world. I am still here, as TM promised, though here has become a relative concept. I watch new visitors arrive occasionally, drawn by the same academic curiosity that brought me to this place. They undergo the ritual, just as I did. They experience the same gradual disconnection from their shadows, the same growing awareness that they've become part of something they thought they were merely observing. And eventually, they join us in the permanent twilight, where the bird-like beings collect and study consciousness with the same dedication we once brought to studying them. The village casts shadows only during eclipses, because that's when the barriers are thin enough for the harvest. The rest of the time, it exists primarily in the spaces between worlds, visible to those who stumble into its sphere of influence but anchored to our reality only through the consciousness it has gathered. I don't know if this account will reach anyone who might heed its warning, or if it will simply fade into the same twilight that claimed its author. But if you're reading this, if you've somehow found your way to the village where buildings cast shadows only during eclipses and inhabitants speak in the voices of birds, know that the ritual they offer is not what it appears to be. And if you choose to participate anyway, drawn by the same irresistible curiosity that drives all of us who study the unknown, remember that some discoveries change not just what we know about the world, but what world we belong to entirely. The next eclipse is coming soon. I can feel its approach in the restless movement of the shadows around me, in the increased activity of the beings who wear human form when visitors arrive. Another researcher will find this place, will undergo the ritual, will join us in the space between spaces. The cycle continues, as it always has, as it always will. And somewhere in the Amazon, a village that shouldn't exist waits patiently for the next curious mind to discover its perfectly crafted invitation to step outside the boundaries of known reality. But perhaps that's exactly what we were looking for all along. Story 5. The first time I heard it, I thought someone had left a radio on. 3:17 a.m., according to the red digits bleeding through my workshop's darkness. I'd been working late again, my fingers cramped around the delicate neck of a 1952 Gibson J45 that had seen better decades. The wood grain whispered stories of smoky clubs and forgotten melodies as I adjusted the tension on its sixth string, coaxing it back to life. Then came the music. A piano, clear as crystal through the thin walls of my converted apartment in the Marigny district. Not the tinny sound of a radio or the compressed audio of a streaming service, but the rich, resonant tones of real hammers striking real strings. The melody drifted down from somewhere above, haunting, incomplete, like a question left hanging in humid New Orleans air. I set down my tools and listened. The building was old, built in 1897 according to the brass plaque by the entrance. 4 stories of weathered brick and wrought iron, divided into 12 units. I'd been living here for 8 months, drawn by the cheap rent and the building's acoustic properties that made it perfect for my restoration work. Most of my neighbors were artists or musicians themselves, so the occasional late-night practice session wasn't unusual. But this was different. The piano played with an urgency that made my skin crawl, each note hanging in the air just a fraction too long, as if reluctant to fade. The melody circled back on itself, repeating the same melancholic phrase with subtle variations, like someone trying to remember a half-forgotten song. I tried to return to my work, but concentration proved impossible. The music seemed to seep through the floorboards, vibrating in my bones. Finally, I gave up and went to bed, but sleep came fitfully. Even with my head buried under pillows, I could hear that piano, playing the same haunting refrain until dawn. The next morning I asked Mrs. Boudreau, my neighbor across the hall, about the music. She was a painter in her 70s who'd lived in the building longer than anyone else. Her roomy eyes narrowed when I described what I'd heard. "Apartment 404, she said, her voice carrying the weight of memory. "Been empty for 2 years now. Landlord can't seem to keep anyone up there long." I climbed to the 4th floor that afternoon, my footsteps echoing in the narrow stairwell. The hallway was dimmer than the others, the overhead fixtures casting uneven pools of sickly yellow light. Apartment 404 sat at the end of the corridor, its green door identical to all the others except for the absence of any personal touches. No nameplate, no doormat, no evidence of habitation. I pressed my ear to the door. Silence. The following night, the piano began again at precisely 3:17. This time, I was ready. I crept upstairs in my bare feet, avoiding the creaky spots I'd memorized during my afternoon reconnaissance. The fourth-floor hallway was darker at night, illuminated only by a single emergency light that cast everything in deep shadows. As I approached apartment 404, the music grew clearer. Not clearer in volume. It remained at the same ethereal level, but more detailed, more present. I could hear the subtle mechanical sounds of the piano's action, the soft whisper of felt hammers, the resonant sustain of each note in what must have been a well-tuned instrument. I knelt before the door and peered through the keyhole. The apartment was dark, but a faint glow emanated from somewhere within, too dim to identify its source. I could make out shapes, furniture maybe, or shadows that might have been furniture. And there, barely visible in the gloom, the outline of what could have been a piano. The music stopped abruptly. I held my breath, my eye still pressed to the keyhole. In the sudden silence, I became acutely aware of my own heartbeat, the whisper of air conditioning, the distant rumble of late-night traffic. Then, slowly, I became aware of something else. I was being watched. The feeling crept up my spine like cold fingers, raising goosebumps despite the building's perpetual warmth. Someone, or something, was looking back at me through that keyhole. I jerked away from the door, my heart hammering, and stumbled backward into the opposite wall. The hallway was empty. The building was silent. But the feeling of being observed lingered, following me back to my apartment like a persistent shadow. Over the next week, the pattern established itself. Every night at 3:17, the piano would begin its melancholy song. Each time, I found myself drawn upstairs, despite my growing unease. The music never varied in its basic structure, but each performance seemed to explore different emotional territories within the same melodic framework. Sometimes it sounded wistful, almost nostalgic. Other nights it carried an undertone of desperate urgency that made my teeth ache. I began researching the building's history, spending my days at the New Orleans Public Library poring over old records and newspaper archives. The building had seen its share of tragedy, as most century-old structures in the city had. Floods, fires, the usual catalog of urban misfortune. But nothing specific to apartment 404, nothing that might explain the nocturnal concerts. It was Mrs. Boudreau who provided the first real clue. I found her in the building's small courtyard one morning, tending to the wild tangle of jasmine that had claimed most of the back wall. "You've been asking questions," she said without preamble, not looking up from her plants. "About the fourth floor." I confirmed this, and she was quiet for so long I thought she'd dismissed me. Finally, she straightened, wiping soil from her hands on a faded apron. "There was a musician," she said, "years ago, before I moved in. Story goes he lived up there, 404, composer of some kind. They say he never finished his masterpiece, died working on it." She fixed me with a sharp look. "But that's just building folklore, you understand. Every old place has its stories." That night, I positioned myself outside apartment 404 before 3:17, armed with my phone to record whatever I might hear. But when the music began, something strange happened to the device. The screen flickered, displaying impossible times, 25:73, 99:99, before going completely black. When I tried to restart it, the battery showed 0%, though it had been fully charged an hour earlier. The music that night was different, more insistent. Instead of the usual melancholic wandering, the melody seemed to be building toward something, reaching for a resolution that never came. As I listened, I began to pick out gaps in the composition, places where additional voices might fit. My musician's ear automatically filled in harmonies, suggested chord progressions that would complement the haunting main theme. Without realizing it, I began humming along. The piano stopped immediately. In the sudden silence, I heard something that made my blood freeze. From within the apartment came the soft sound of footsteps. Moving toward the door, I pressed myself against the wall, hardly daring to breathe, as the footsteps stopped just on the other side of the wood. The doorknob turned slowly, silently, until I heard the soft click of the latch releasing. But the door didn't open. I waited, counting my heartbeats, until the footsteps retreated. Only then did I risk looking at the door. The knob had returned to its original position, but something white showed beneath the gap at the bottom of the door. A piece of paper slipped out while I'd been frozen in terror. With trembling fingers, I retrieved the paper. It was sheet music, handwritten in an elegant script that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. The melody line matched what I'd been hearing each night, but this version extended further, showing measures beyond where the phantom pianist always stopped. The staff lines continued for several more bars, but they were empty, waiting for notes that had never been written. At the bottom of the page, in the same flowing script, were the words, "Complete me." I stumbled back to my apartment, the sheet music clutched in my sweating palm. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself the entire episode had been a stress-induced hallucination. The paper, however, remained stubbornly real, lying on my kitchen table like an accusation. I spent the day trying to work, but my hands shook too badly to handle the delicate guitar restoration. Every few minutes, I found myself looking at the sheet music, my mind automatically completing the unfinished measures. The composition was beautiful, sophisticated in a way that spoke of genuine talent. Whoever had written it understood music not just as notes on a page, but as a living thing capable of profound emotional communication. That evening, I sat at my small electronic keyboard and played through the existing measures. The melody was even more haunting when I played it myself, and the unfinished ending felt like a physical ache. My fingers began exploring possible continuations, searching for the resolution the composition so desperately needed. At 3:17, the piano began upstairs, but this time, I could hear more than just the piano. Faint at first, then growing stronger, came the sound of other instruments. Strings, violins maybe, or violas, weaving delicate harmonies around the main theme. The music was no longer a solo performance but an ensemble piece, rich and complex and achingly beautiful. I ran upstairs, taking the steps 3 at a time. The 4th-floor hallway was wrong somehow, longer than it should have been, the walls seeming to stretch away into impossible distances. The music grew louder as I approached apartment 404, but it was accompanied now by something else, a faint luminescence seeping from beneath the door. This time, when I looked through the keyhole, I could see clearly. The apartment was full of instruments, but they weren't resting on stands or tables. They floated in the air, suspended by invisible strings, each one playing its part in the otherworldly orchestra. A piano dominated the center of the room, its keys depressing and releasing in perfect synchronization with the music, though no one sat at the bench. Violins danced through the air, their bows moving across strings guided by translucent fingers that seemed more suggestion than substance. And at a music stand near the window, a new piece of sheet music was writing itself, notes appearing on the staff in flowing lines of silver ink. The music reached a crescendo, then stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, every instrument in that impossible orchestra turned toward the door. Toward me. I stumbled backward, but found myself unable to move away from the door. Something invisible but unmistakably real had wrapped around my wrists, thin as spider silk, but strong as steel cable. The sensation traveled up my arms, tightening around my biceps, my shoulders, lifting my hands against my will. The door to apartment 404 swung open. Inside, the translucent figures were clearer now. Musicians from different eras, their period clothing marking them as members of various decades or centuries. They watched me with eyes that held the desperate hunger of unfinished business, their phantom instruments still hovering in the air around them. The sheet music on the stand, my sheet music, the page I'd been given, was filling itself in, note by note, with silver ink that gleamed in the supernatural light. But it needed something more, something that could only come from the living world, from me. My guitar hung on my back, where I'd unconsciously strapped it before rushing upstairs. The invisible bonds around my arms were stronger now, pulling me forward, into the room, toward the waiting orchestra. I understood what they wanted, what they needed to complete their eternal performance. My strings, my music, my life. As I crossed the threshold, the door began to close behind me. In the hallway, I could see my reflection in the old mirror hanging by the stairwell, but it was already growing translucent, already beginning to fade. The orchestra raised their instruments in welcome, and the phantom conductor lifted his baton. On the music stand, the final measures of the composition waited to be born, and I knew that once I played them, once I completed what had been started so long ago, I would never leave this room. The piano began the familiar melody, and despite everything, I found my fingers moving to the guitar strings. The music was so beautiful, so perfect, that finishing it seemed less like a surrender than a privilege. Each note I added to the composition felt like coming home, like finding the missing piece of a puzzle I'd been trying to solve my entire life. As the final chord rang out, I realized I could no longer feel my heartbeat. I'm writing this now on paper that appears whenever I need it, with ink that flows from a pen that never runs dry. The orchestra plays every night at 3:17, and I play with them, my guitar weaving through melodies that span centuries. We are always working on new compositions, always reaching for that perfect song that will finally set us free. Sometimes I see someone new in the hallway, pressing their ear to our door. Sometimes they're musicians themselves, drawn by the same irresistible pull that brought me here. I want to warn them, but the music is so beautiful, and we are always looking for new voices to join our eternal performance. If you live in an old building and hear music at night, music that seems to come from empty rooms and impossible places, I have one piece of advice. Don't listen too closely. Don't try to complete what should remain unfinished. And whatever you do, don't look through the keyhole. The orchestra is always auditioning new members, and the audition never ends. Story 6. The green neon buzzed like dying insects against the desert night. I'd been driving Route 66 for 3 weeks now, testing recipes from every greasy spoon and roadside joint I could find, documenting flavors for my food truck concept. The notebook on my passenger seat was thick with scribbled notes and grease stains. But this place wasn't in any guidebook. The diner materialized from the darkness like a mirage in reverse, its sickly emerald glow casting everything in an underwater pallor. No name on the sign, just that endless stuttering buzz that seemed to crawl under my skin. The parking lot held only 2 other vehicles, a rusted pickup and a sedan so covered in dust it looked like it had been sitting there since the Eisenhower administration. My headlights swept across windows that reflected nothing back, not even my own face. The bell above the door wheezed rather than chimed when I entered. The interior matched the neon's promise. Everything bathed in that same nauseating green light that made my hands look corpse pale. Vinyl booths lined the walls, their red upholstery faded to the color of dried blood. A handful of customers sat scattered throughout, but something about them felt wrong. They were too still, too quiet, like mannequins posed in a store window. The waiter appeared beside me without warning. I hadn't heard footsteps. His smile stretched too wide, revealing teeth that seemed to glow faintly in the light. "Welcome, traveler," he said, his voice carrying an odd echo despite the cramped space. "First time?" I nodded, sliding into the nearest booth. The vinyl stuck to my jeans with an audible sound. "Just passing through, testing local flavors for a project." "Ah, a culinary adventurer." His eyes gleamed with something that might have been amusement or hunger. "Then you simply must try our welcome dish, house specialty. On the house, of course." Before I could respond, he glided away toward the kitchen. I say glided because I never saw his feet touch the floor, just that same soundless movement that had brought him to my table. The other customers remained motionless, their faces turned toward their plates like worshippers at some grotesque altar. The air tasted metallic, electric, like the moment before lightning strikes. When the waiter returned, he carried a plate that seemed to vibrate in his hands. The dish looked ordinary enough, a stir-fry of vegetables and what appeared to be chicken, steam rising from the surface in delicate spirals. But the smell hit me like a physical blow. Ozone. The sharp, clean scent of electrical storms and burnt air. "The welcome dish," he announced, setting it before me with ceremonial precision. "A recipe passed down through generations. It has very special properties." The first bite should have burned my tongue. Instead, it felt cool, almost refreshing, despite the visible steam. The flavor was indescribable. Not quite meat, not quite vegetable, but something that seemed to shift and change as I chewed. And then, as I swallowed, the world tilted. The whispers started immediately. At first, I thought it was just the ambient noise of the diner, conversations from other tables bleeding into my consciousness. But as I listened, the words became clearer, more distinct. They weren't coming from the other customers, who remained as still as ever. They were coming from somewhere else entirely. I never should have left her alone that night. The money wasn't mine to take. I knew the bridge was unsafe, but I said nothing. The voices layered over each other, a chorus of confession and regret that seemed to emanate from the very walls. I pressed my palms against my ears, but the sound didn't diminish. If anything, it grew louder, more insistent. I could have stopped him if I'd spoken up. She trusted me with the secret. I saw the car coming and didn't warn them. "What is this?" I managed to gasp, looking up at the waiter who still stood beside my table, that same impossible smile stretching his features. "The welcome dish," he repeated, as if that explained everything. "You're hearing them now, aren't you? The regrets, the sins, the weights that these poor souls carry." I tried to stand, but my legs felt like water. The whispers were getting louder, more numerous, until they became a roar of human failing and moral collapse. The other customers had turned to look at me now, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes reflecting that same green light. "What did you do to me?" The waiter's expression didn't change, but somehow his presence felt larger, more oppressive. "Nothing you haven't done to yourself. The dish reveals truth, nothing more, but it also collects. You see, this establishment serves a very particular purpose. We cleanse travelers of their burdens." "I don't understand." "You will." He leaned closer, and I caught a whiff of ozone from his breath. "Everyone who tastes our welcome dish becomes a vessel, a receptacle for the sins and regrets of others. You'll absorb them, carry them, purify them through your own suffering. It's really quite noble when you think about it." The whispers were becoming more specific now, more personal. I could see images forming in my mind, fragments of other people's memories, their moments of weakness and moral failure. A man watching his neighbor's house burn while knowing he could have prevented it. A woman walking away from a car accident she'd caused. Children left alone while parents pursued their own selfish desires. But these weren't just random confessions. They were becoming part of me, settling into my consciousness like sediment in still water. I could feel my own thoughts being pushed aside to make room for this growing catalog of human failing. How do I make it stop? The waiter straightened, smoothing down his apron with hands that seemed to have too many joints. "Oh, it doesn't stop. Not ever. Unless what? Unless you pass it on. Find another traveler, another soul in need of cleansing, and convince them to taste our welcome dish. Then their burden becomes yours to carry, and yours becomes, well, let's just say it finds other accommodations." I looked around the diner with new eyes. The other customers weren't customers at all. They were prisoners, just like I was about to become. Their stillness wasn't peaceful. It was the paralysis of minds overwhelmed by accumulated guilt and regret. And if I refuse, if I just leave? The waiter's smile faltered for the first time, revealing something hungry and ancient beneath the facade. Oh, you can leave. But the sins you've collected, they'll follow you. They'll manifest, take shape, hunt you down every mile of highway between here and wherever you're running to. Better to stay, don't you think? Better to accept your purpose. I fumbled for my wallet, throwing bills on the table with shaking hands. The whispers were getting louder, more insistent, and I could feel something dark and substantial growing in my chest, a weight that hadn't been there before. I'm leaving. Of course you are. The waiter stepped aside with mock courtesy. Do give our regards to the road, won't you? The bell wheezed again as I stumbled out into the night. My truck seemed impossibly far away, and every step felt like walking through molasses. Behind me, the green neon continued its relentless buzzing, but now I could hear something else in that sound. Laughter, low and satisfied. I reached my truck and gunned the engine, not caring about the scream of tires on asphalt as I peeled out of the parking lot. In my rearview mirror, the diner receded into darkness, but the whispers in my head continued unabated. I never should have taken that shortcut. The prescription wasn't for me. I knew she was lying, but I let her anyway. Mile after mile, the confessions poured into my consciousness. Other people's sins, other people's regrets, all becoming part of my mental landscape. I tried turning up the radio, but the music sounded flat and distant compared to the growing chorus in my head. It was around the 50-mile mark that I first saw them in my mirrors, shapes, moving in the darkness behind my headlights. At first, I thought they were just tricks of light and shadow, but as I watched, they became more defined. Humanoid figures, but wrong somehow. Elongated limbs, faces that shifted and blurred like smoke. They kept pace with my truck effortlessly, running alongside the highway with movements that defied physics. I pressed harder on the accelerator. The speedometer needle climbed past 80, past 90, but the shapes remained constant in my mirrors. If anything, there seemed to be more of them now, a growing parade of manifestations that corresponded to each new voice in my head. I saw him fall, and didn't help. The test results were negative, but I said positive. She asked for help, and I pretended not to hear. With each new confession came a new shadow shape, until my mirrors showed a small army of the things keeping perfect pace with my vehicle. My hands cramped from gripping the steering wheel so tight, and sweat stung my eyes despite the desert cold. I pulled into the next truck stop, a brightly lit oasis that promised normalcy and human contact. But as I sat in my truck, engine running, I realized I couldn't get out. Not because of any physical restraint, but because of what I might bring with me. The whispers were constant now, a background hum of human failing that I couldn't turn off. What if I infected others just by being near them? What if my presence somehow made them vulnerable to the same curse that had claimed me? A family walked past my truck, parents and 2 teenage children laughing about something, carrying bags from the convenience store. For a moment, one of the kids looked directly at me through my windshield, and I saw his expression change. His smile faded, replaced by something like confusion or concern. Could he hear it too? Was it already spreading? I threw the truck in reverse and backed away from the lights, from the people, from the possibility of contaminating anyone else with whatever I'd become. The shadow shapes had disappeared with the dawn, but I could feel them out there, waiting for darkness to return. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, and behind me, invisible but undeniable, the green neon diner continued its work. How many others had sat in that booth? How many travelers had tasted the welcome dish and found themselves transformed into unwilling vessels for humanity's moral refuse? And more troubling still, what if none of it was real? What if the stress of weeks on the road, the isolation, the strange hours and stranger food had finally cracked something in my mind? What if I was simply having a breakdown, hallucinating voices and shadow creatures while driving aimlessly through the desert? But then I thought about the weight in my chest, the growing catalog of sins that felt more real than my own memories. I thought about the perfect taste of ozone and the waiter's impossible smile. I thought about the way the other customers had turned to look at me with their hollow, knowing eyes. Real or not, it was mine now. This burden, this curse, this responsibility for the moral failures of strangers. I could drive forever, but I'd never escape it. The whispers would continue, the shadows would return each night, and somewhere behind me, that green neon would keep buzzing, waiting for the next traveler to stop and taste their welcome dish. I reached for my notebook, the one filled with recipes and observations from my journey. With shaking hands, I began to write. Day 22. Found a place that serves more than food. The welcome dish tastes like lightning and leaves you changed. The price isn't money. Warning to future self. Some hungers should never be fed. In my rearview mirror, the road stretched back into darkness. Somewhere in that darkness, I knew the shadows were gathering again, patient as predators, faithful as sins. And in my head, the whispers continued their endless catalog of human failure, each voice a weight I'd carry until I could find someone else to taste what I had tasted. The question wasn't whether I'd go back to the diner. The question was whether I'd be strong enough to resist the temptation when I did. Because deep down, beneath all the horror and revulsion, I knew I would go back. The weight was becoming unbearable, and the waiter's offer, to pass this burden to another, grew more appealing with each mile. That's the real horror, isn't it? Not the supernatural curse or the shadow creatures or the impossible diner that shouldn't exist. The real horror is knowing that given enough time, enough suffering, enough whispered confessions of strangers' sins, I'll eventually become exactly what I'm trying to escape. And maybe that's the point. Maybe that's what the green neon has been teaching all along. Story 7. The call came in at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that felt like the world had forgotten how to breathe. Mrs. Ferreira's voice crackled through the department phone, each word dripping with the kind of fear that makes seasoned social workers sit up straight. She spoke of screaming that echoed from the abandoned ranch on the outskirts of town, sounds that carried on windless nights and made her dogs whimper behind locked doors. I'd been working these rural cases for 8 years, long enough to know that isolation breeds its own particular brand of darkness. But as I drove the dusty road toward the property, something felt different. The afternoon sun hung wrong in the sky, casting shadows that seemed to bend against their natural direction. My radio had started picking up static somewhere around kilometer 15, not the usual dead air of rural interference, but something that almost sounded like whispered conversations bleeding through from another frequency. The ranch house materialized through a grove of eucalyptus trees like a wound in the landscape. 2 stories of weathered wood and cracked tile, with windows that reflected nothing despite the dying light. The silence was absolute, the kind that presses against your eardrums and makes you hyper-aware of your own heartbeat. I parked beside a rusted mailbox that bore no name, just a series of scratches that might have once been numbers. The front door stood ajar, revealing a slice of darkness that seemed to swallow the late afternoon sun. I called out in the practiced tone of someone accustomed to walking into situations where anything might be waiting. No response came, but something else did. A faint mechanical clicking, rhythmic and deliberate, like the sound of an old cassette player advancing its tape. Inside, the house told a story of violence contained within walls. Furniture lay scattered in patterns that suggested both struggle and intentional arrangement. A dining table rested upside down, its legs pointing toward the ceiling like the limbs of a dead insect. Chairs were embedded in the drywall at impossible angles, their wooden frames splintered but somehow still maintaining their basic shape. The floor was a constellation of broken glass, family photographs, and what appeared to be the remnants of multiple analog recording devices. The clicking sound grew louder as I moved deeper into the house. It seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, a mechanical heartbeat that made my skin crawl with recognition I couldn't place. In what had once been the living room, I discovered the source. Dozens of cassette players, some ancient and others merely old, scattered across the floor like fallen dominoes. Most were broken, their plastic cases cracked and their internal mechanisms exposed, but a few continued their eternal clicking, advancing empty tape spools with the dedication of clockwork. I knelt beside the nearest functioning device and pressed play. The voice that emerged was female, middle-aged, thick with an accent I recognized as local. She was arguing with someone whose responses came through clearly despite their obvious distance from the microphone. The conversation was heated but domestic. Accusations about money, about time spent away from home, about promises broken and trust betrayed. Normal family dysfunction amplified by the particular acoustics of anger. But then it ended, as Mrs. Ferreira had warned me it would. The male voice, previously defensive and loud, dropped to a whisper that barely registered above the tape hiss. One word, spoken with a finality that made my spine straighten. Stay. I moved to another player, then another. Each tape contained a different argument, different voices, different complaints, but every single recording concluded with that same whispered command. Stay. The word began to feel like a physical presence in the room, as if each repetition added weight to the air around me. Professional protocol demanded I document everything. I photographed the scene, sketched the layout of destroyed furniture, bagged several of the functional cassette players as potential evidence. One device, smaller than the others and apparently undamaged, caught my attention. Unlike the others, its tape compartment was empty, and when I pressed the record button, a small red light indicated it was ready to capture whatever sounds the house might offer. The decision to take it seemed logical at the time. The device could provide valuable insight into whatever had transpired here. I slipped it into my jacket pocket and continued my investigation, unaware that I had just crossed a threshold from which returning would require more than simply walking back through the front door. The upper floor revealed more of the same chaos, with one crucial difference. The recordings here were more recent. I could tell by the clarity of the sound and the modern appliances humming in the background. These tapes captured conversations that had taken place within the last few months, maybe weeks. The voices were different, unfamiliar, but the pattern remained constant. Arguments that escalated, emotions that peaked, and then that whispered conclusion. Stay. By the time I returned to my car, the sun had begun its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades that reminded me uncomfortably of dried blood. I placed the empty recorder on my passenger seat and started the engine, eager to put distance between myself and whatever had happened in that house. The drive back to town should have taken 40 minutes. I know this because I'd driven that same route dozens of times over the years. But as I navigated the winding rural roads, I became aware that my radio was no longer producing static. Instead, it was playing back my own voice, speaking words I had no memory of saying. I was describing the house, but not as I had seen it. This version of my voice spoke of rooms I hadn't entered, details I hadn't observed, people I hadn't encountered. I was apparently conducting interviews, asking questions about family dynamics and domestic situations, receiving responses that seemed to come from multiple speakers positioned around an invisible room. I reached for the radio dial to change the station, but froze when I heard my own voice ask, "And when did you first notice the changes in his behavior?" The response came immediately, clear as if the speaker were sitting beside me. "After he brought that thing home, that little machine. He said it was for work, but I knew better. I knew what it really was." My hands trembled as I pulled over to the roadside. The recorder in my jacket pocket felt warm against my ribs, and when I removed it, I discovered that its red recording light was glowing steadily. I had not pressed the record button since leaving the house, but somehow the device was active, capturing sound, processing it, storing it for later playback. I opened the battery compartment. It was empty. The logical explanation presented itself immediately. The device was malfunctioning, creating the illusion of operation without power. Electronics could behave strangely when damaged. But logic felt thin in the gathering darkness, especially when I pressed the play button and heard my own voice emerging from the speaker, conducting an interview I had never given. The questions I was asking were professional, appropriate for a social worker investigating potential domestic abuse. But the responses revealed information I couldn't have known. Names of family members, details about the property's history, descriptions of escalating arguments that had taken place over a period of months. Someone was providing me with a complete case file through the medium of my own voice, as if I had been present for events that had occurred long before my arrival. Night fell with unusual speed, or perhaps I had lost track of time while listening to the impossible recordings. I found myself parked outside my apartment building with no clear memory of the remainder of the drive. The recorder continued its warm presence against my palm, its red light pulsing like a tiny heartbeat. Inside my apartment, I placed the device on my kitchen table and attempted to approach the situation with professional detachment. I would analyze the recordings, determine their origin, and include them in my report as evidence of whatever psychological disturbance had affected the ranch's previous occupants. Mental illness could manifest in elaborate ways, and perhaps someone had spent months creating these fictional conversations as a form of self-therapy or delusion. But as I listened, the recordings began to change. The conversations were no longer historical. They were current, real-time, and they featured my voice asking questions I was not speaking aloud. "How long have you been in the house?" my recorded voice inquired. I had not asked this question, but my mouth opened anyway, and I heard myself respond. "Since this afternoon. I came to investigate a report." "And what did you find?" Again, I found myself answering without conscious intention. Broken furniture, recordings, evidence of some kind of disturbance. The conversation continued despite my growing alarm. My recorded voice conducted a thorough interview while I sat silent in my kitchen, my actual voice providing responses that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. I was describing events I hadn't witnessed, emotions I hadn't experienced, people I hadn't met. Hours passed in this manner. The recorder never showed signs of fatigue, never required new batteries, never indicated that its memory was full. It simply continued collecting my voice, storing my responses, building an archive of conversations I was not choosing to have. Around midnight, I realized I was no longer alone in these discussions. Other voices had joined the recording, the same voices I had heard on the tapes in the house. They were asking me questions now, interviewing me about my work, my background, my reasons for visiting the ranch. Their questions were invasive but polite, professional but persistent. They wanted to know about my training, my caseload, my procedures for handling difficult situations. "And what would you do?" asked a voice I recognized as the middle-aged woman from the first tape. "If you discovered that your investigation had changed you somehow, if you found yourself becoming part of the very situation you were meant to document?" My voice responded without hesitation. "I would follow protocol, document everything, report to my supervisor, seek appropriate support." But what if protocol no longer applied? What if the situation existed outside normal parameters? Then I would... My voice faltered, and for the first time since the recording began, I felt as if I had some control over my responses. I would need to understand what was happening before I could determine appropriate action. The woman's laughter was gentle but knowing. Understanding comes with commitment. You cannot observe from outside indefinitely. Eventually, every investigator must choose whether to remain detached or become part of the evidence. I looked at the kitchen clock. 3:15 in the morning. In a few hours the sun would rise, and I would need to return the recorder to the ranch. This thought came to me fully formed, as if it had always been part of my plan, though I could not remember deciding to return the device at all. The conversation on the tape continued, but now it included multiple voices, all of them familiar despite my certainty that I had never heard them before. They spoke with the easy camaraderie of people who had known each other for years, discussing cases, comparing experiences, sharing the particular frustrations of social work in rural areas. They talked about me as if I were present but unable to hear them, describing my investigation, my thoroughness, my obvious dedication to helping people in difficult situations. They seemed impressed by my attention to detail, my careful documentation, my willingness to take evidence home for proper analysis. "He's exactly what we need," said a male voice that sounded like my father but wasn't. "Someone who understands the importance of complete investigation. Someone who won't walk away from a case until he has all the answers." "Yes," agreed the woman. "But does he understand what complete investigation requires? Does he know that some evidence can only be gathered by becoming part of the situation?" I wanted to speak, to ask what they meant, to demand explanations. But my voice was already committed to the recording, already providing responses to questions I wasn't hearing in real time. I had become a passive observer of my own participation in conversations that seemed to be taking place in multiple temporal dimensions simultaneously. The sky outside my kitchen window began to lighten, though sunrise was still hours away. Or perhaps it wasn't. Time felt negotiable in the presence of the recorder, elastic and subjective. Minutes could stretch into hours, or hours could compress into moments, depending on the needs of the conversation. I understood, with the clarity that comes only in dreams or nightmares, that I would indeed return to the ranch. Not because I had been commanded to, but because the investigation was incomplete. The recorder contained information essential to understanding what had happened to the missing family, and professional responsibility demanded that I see the case through to its conclusion. The voices on the tape were agreeing with my reasoning, praising my dedication, welcoming me back to the house where everything would finally make sense. They spoke of the relief I would feel when the investigation was complete, when all questions had been answered, when I could finally rest, knowing that I had done everything possible to help. "Just remember," the woman's voice said as the recording approached its inevitable conclusion, "once you understand everything, you'll need to help the next investigator. You'll need to guide them through the same process, help them gather the same evidence, ensure they reach the same conclusions." My recorded voice responded with enthusiasm. "Of course. It's important that the work continues, that each case receives proper attention." "Exactly," she said, and I could hear her smile in the warmth of her tone. "You're going to do wonderfully here. We're so pleased you decided to stay." The recorder clicked off, its red light finally dimming. Outside, the sun was indeed rising, painting my kitchen in shades of gold and amber that should have been comforting, but felt instead like the glow of a funeral pyre. I placed the device back in my jacket pocket and walked to my car. The drive to the ranch felt like coming home, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I was traveling in the wrong direction. Behind me, the city was waking up, people beginning their normal days, unaware that somewhere in the rural darkness, an investigation was about to reach its proper conclusion. The house looked exactly as I had left it, except for one small detail. On the kitchen table sat an old cassette player, its tape compartment open and waiting. I placed my recorder beside it and pressed play one final time. My voice emerged from the speaker, clear and confident, conducting an interview with practiced efficiency. I was asking all the right questions, following proper procedure, documenting everything with professional thoroughness. In the background, I could hear other voices offering encouragement and guidance, helping me understand the importance of complete investigation. As I listened, I realized that the interview was not a recording of past events. It was happening now, in real time, and I was both the interviewer and the subject. I was investigating myself, documenting my own case, creating evidence that would help the next social worker understand what they would need to do when they arrived to investigate my disappearance. The sun climbed higher, warming the house and making the shadows retreat to their proper corners. Somewhere in the distance, a phone was ringing, probably my supervisor wondering why I hadn't returned to the office. Soon, someone would be assigned to investigate my case, to follow the same procedures I had followed, to take the same evidence I had taken. I settled into a chair beside the cassette player and waited for them to arrive. After all, every investigator deserves proper guidance, and I had so much to share about the importance of thorough documentation. They would understand, just as I had understood, that some cases require complete commitment. The recorder clicked, advancing to a fresh section of tape, ready to capture whatever conversations might be necessary to help the next visitor understand their role in the investigation. Outside, the day continued its normal progression, but inside the house, time moved according to different rules. Rules that prioritized completeness over efficiency, understanding over escape, commitment over convenience. I practiced my interview questions, preparing for the moment when I would need to help someone else discover what I had discovered, learn what I had learned, choose what I had chosen. After all, everyone deserves the opportunity to stay. Story 8. The heat had been pressing down on us for hours, thick and merciless, turning the air inside our rental car into something you had to chew before breathing. Maria dozed in the passenger seat, her dark hair clinging to her neck with perspiration, while I gripped the steering wheel and tried to focus on the endless ribbon of asphalt cutting through the Brazilian sertão. The landscape stretched out in all directions like a fever dream, scraggly vegetation, red earth, and a sky so bleached by the sun it hurt to look at. We'd been driving since dawn, leaving Salvador behind for a romantic getaway in the interior. The GPS had stopped working 2 hours ago, its screen flickering with frustrated electronic hiccups before going dark completely. I'd assured Maria we were fine, that I remembered the route from studying the map the night before. But now, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, doubt gnawed at my confidence like termites in old wood. The road ahead shimmered with heat mirages, creating the illusion of water that vanished as soon as we approached. It was hypnotic, almost peaceful, until I noticed something that made my pulse quicken. In the distance, maybe half a mile ahead, dark shapes blocked the highway. As we drew closer, the shapes resolved into vehicles, 2 pickup trucks positioned across both lanes, creating an impromptu checkpoint. Men stood beside the trucks, their silhouettes wavering in the heat like figures emerging from a nightmare. Even from this distance, something about their posture struck me as wrong. They stood too still, too purposeful, like sentinels guarding a secret. Maria stirred as I began to slow the car, her eyes fluttering open. She sat up, immediately alert in that way people become when they sense danger through sleep. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice thick with drowsiness and concern. I nodded toward the checkpoint ahead. The men were becoming clearer now, and what I saw made my mouth go dry. They wore masks, not medical masks or bandanas, but theatrical masks that covered their entire faces. Plain white masks with no features except dark holes for eyes. In their hands, they held flashlights, but something was wrong with them too. The light pointed inward, toward the masks themselves, creating an eerie glow that made their faces look like hollow skulls floating in the gathering dusk. "Probably just a routine checkpoint," I said, though my voice betrayed my uncertainty. In Brazil, such stops weren't uncommon, but everything about this felt different. Wrong. As we approached, one of the masked figures raised his hand, a universal gesture to stop. I had no choice but to comply, bringing our car to a halt about 20 feet from the nearest truck. The engine idled with mechanical indifference, while my heart hammered against my ribs. 3 of them approached our car with deliberate, measured steps. The one in the center seemed to be their leader, distinguished only by the fact that his mask appeared slightly larger than the others. They moved like people walking underwater, each step calculated and strange. The inverted flashlights created grotesque shadows that danced across their masks, making it impossible to tell where they were looking. The leader reached my window and made a circular motion with his finger. I hesitated for a moment before rolling it down, immediately regretting the decision as the oppressive heat rushed in, carrying with it an odd smell, something like burnt metal and old flowers. The masked figure leaned down, bringing his face close to the window. The inverted flashlight cast an otherworldly glow across his mask, and through the eye holes I could see nothing but darkness. When he spoke, his voice was muffled and distorted, as if coming from the bottom of a well. "Names," he said simply. "We need your real names for the register." Maria's hand found mine across the center console, her palm damp with sweat. I cleared my throat, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "I'm sorry. What kind of checkpoint is this? We're just tourists, heading to—" "Real names," the figure interrupted, his voice gaining an edge that made the hair on my arms stand up. "We must register your passage through this territory, your true names, the ones your mothers whispered when you were born, the ones that live in your blood." The way he said it sent ice through my veins despite the heat. There was something ritualistic about his words, as if he were reciting from an ancient script. The other 2 figures had positioned themselves on either side of our car, their inverted lights creating a circle of wrong illumination around us. "Look, we're not looking for any trouble," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We're just passing through. We can show you our passports, identification." "Names." the leader repeated, and now there was something almost musical about his voice, like a lullaby sung in a minor key. Give us your names willingly, and your passage will be swift. Refuse, and you will remain here until the words fall from your tongues like rotten fruit, until you forget the shape of your own identity, until silence becomes your only language. Maria's grip on my hand tightened, her nails digging into my palm. I could feel her trembling, and when I glanced at her, I saw terror etched across her features. But beneath the fear, I caught something else, a look of recognition, as if she had heard these words before. We should go, she whispered, so quietly I almost missed it. Now. Something in her tone convinced me. Without another word to the masked figures, I slammed the car into reverse, pressing the accelerator hard. The car lurched backward, tires squealing against the hot asphalt. In the rearview mirror, I saw the three figures standing motionless, their inverted lights still glowing like beacons from hell. But as I spun the wheel and shifted into drive, preparing to speed away from this nightmare, something impossible happened. The landscape around us didn't change. The checkpoint remained exactly where it had been, the same distance ahead of us, as if we had never moved at all. I looked at the speedometer, 60 kilometers per hour, then 70, then 80. The engine roared, the wind whipped through the open windows, and yet the checkpoint stayed fixed in place like a photograph that refused to develop. The rocks beside the road, the twisted tree that had been on our left, even the shadows cast by the declining sun, everything remained identical to what it had been moments before. This isn't possible, I muttered, my voice lost in the wind. I pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing the car to its limits, but still the scene refused to change. We were moving. I could feel it, hear it, see the speedometer climbing, but we were also standing perfectly still, trapped in a single moment like insects in amber. Maria had gone silent beside me, her breathing shallow and rapid. When I looked at her, her face had gone pale beneath her tan, and she was staring straight ahead, with the fixed intensity of someone trying to wake up from a nightmare. "They're still there," she said, her voice barely audible above the engine noise. "They're exactly where they were." I slammed on the brakes, bringing us to a sudden stop. The checkpoint was still ahead of us, unchanged, the masked figures still standing in their grotesque tableau. It was as if the last few minutes had never happened, as if our desperate escape had been nothing more than an illusion. "How long have we been driving?" Maria asked, and something in her voice made me check my watch. The digital display showed the same time it had when we first approached the checkpoint. Not a single minute had passed. That's when I noticed other details that chilled me to the bone. The sun hadn't moved in the sky. The shadows were exactly the same length and angle they had been before. Even the heat mirages on the road ahead rippled in identical patterns, like a video loop playing endlessly. "We need to give them what they want," Maria said suddenly, her voice hollow and distant. "They won't let us pass until we do." I turned to look at her, really look at her, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. There was something different about her face, something I couldn't quite identify. Her features were the same, but there was a quality to her expression that seemed unfamiliar. "What did you say?" I asked. "I said we need to give them our names, our real names. It's the only way out." But that wasn't what she had said before. Before, she had been the one urging us to flee. Before, she had been afraid. Now, there was a calm acceptance in her voice that filled me with dread. "Maria," I said slowly, "how do you know what they want?" She turned to look at me, and for a split second, I could have sworn her eyes reflected the light like an animal's. Then she blinked, and they were normal again, brown and familiar and concerned. "You told me," she said simply. "You just told me what they said." Had I? The conversation already seemed distant, like something that had happened in a dream. I tried to remember the exact words the masked figure had used, but they slipped away from my memory like water through cupped hands. The leader was approaching our car again, his movements exactly the same as before, the same measured pace, the same underwater quality. But this time, I noticed details I had missed before. His clothes weren't quite clothes. They were more like shadows shaped into the suggestion of fabric, and his breathing, or what should have been breathing, made no sound at all. He reached the window and leaned down, bringing that terrible mask close to my face. The smell hit me again, burnt metal and old flowers, but now I recognized it. It was the smell of memory itself, of thoughts left too long in the sun until they spoiled. "Names," he said, and his voice was different now, hungrier. I found myself opening my mouth to respond, the words forming on my tongue without my permission. But before I could speak, a part of my mind that still functioned rationally screamed at me to stop. Instead, I rolled up the window and tried to drive away again. The same thing happened. We moved but didn't move, traveled but arrived nowhere. The checkpoint remained fixed ahead of us like a mirage that had decided to become real. But this time, I noticed something new. Each time we tried to escape, the masked figures multiplied. Where there had been 3, now there were 6, then 12. They stood in perfect formation, their inverted lights creating a galaxy of wrong stars in the gathering darkness. "How many times have we tried this?" I asked Maria, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. She looked at me with that same strange calm, and when she spoke, her voice seemed to come from very far away. "Does it matter? Time doesn't work here. Nothing works here except their rules." The temperature inside the car had begun to drop, despite the oppressive heat outside. Our breath started to mist, and frost began forming on the windows. Impossible in the Brazilian sertão, but happening nonetheless. The world outside took on a dreamlike quality, colors bleeding and shifting like watercolors in the rain. I tried to remember how we had gotten here, but the memories felt distant and unreliable. Had we really been driving for hours? Had we really left Salvador that morning? The more I tried to grasp these recollections, the more they dissolved, leaving only fragments. Maria's laugh at breakfast, the feeling of sunlight through the windshield, the weight of my wallet in my back pocket. My wallet. Suddenly it felt important to check that it was still there. I reached back and felt for it, but my fingers found only empty pocket. Panic shot through me like electricity. When had I lost it? Had I ever had it? "Maria," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "What's your last name?" She looked at me with surprise, then confusion, then something approaching fear. "It's," she began, then stopped. Her mouth moved silently for a moment before she tried again. "It's the same as the one I've always had." But she couldn't say it. The word wouldn't come. I watched her struggle with increasing desperation, her face contorting with effort as she tried to produce a sound that had somehow become impossible. That's when I realized I was having the same problem. My own last name, which I had spoken thousands of times throughout my life, had vanished from my mind like smoke. Not just forgotten, erased, as if it had never existed at all. The masked figures were moving closer now, their circle tightening around our car. Some carried clipboards that might have been made of shadow and bone. Others held what looked like pens, though they cast no reflections and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Through the frost-covered windows, I could see them beginning to write, their movements synchronized like a macabre ballet. Each stroke of their pens sent visible shivers through the air, as if they were writing on reality itself. "They're taking our names," Maria whispered, and her voice was already becoming fainter, less substantial. "Even the ones we can't remember. They're writing them down and making them theirs." I tried to start the car again, but my hand passed through the key as if it were made of mist. The car itself was becoming translucent, fading like a photograph left too long in the sun. Soon, there would be nothing left but the checkpoint, the masked figures, and the two of us, or whatever we were becoming. The leader approached one final time, and now I could see that his clipboard was filling with writing that hurt to look at directly. Names written in languages that predated speech, in symbols that existed only in the spaces between thoughts. "Your passage is almost complete," he said, and his voice came from inside my own head now. "Soon you will be free to continue your journey." You will remember nothing of this delay, nothing of this place. You will arrive at your destination refreshed and happy, with new names and clean histories. Through the rapidly disappearing windshield, I could see a road opening beyond the checkpoint. The same road we had been traveling, but somehow different. Brighter, more real than real. It beckoned like a promise of return to the ordinary world. All we require, the figure continued, is your consent. Say yes, and you may pass. Say no, and remain here forever, growing thinner and thinner until you are nothing but whispers in the wind. I felt Maria's hand slip away from mine, not because she had moved, but because we were both becoming less solid, less present. The choice seemed obvious, inevitable. What were names anyway? Just sounds, just marks on paper. Surely they were a small price to pay for freedom. But as I opened my mouth to give consent, a single terrifying thought pierced through the growing fog in my mind. If we agreed to this, if we let them take our names and give us new ones, would we still be us when we reached the other side? Or would we be something else entirely, wearing our faces like masks, living our lives like actors who had forgotten they were in a play? The question hung in the air like smoke, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Around us, the checkpoint waited with infinite patience, eternal as the desert itself, ready to make its trade. Safe passage in exchange for the one thing that made us irreplaceable. The choice was ours, and time was running out. Or perhaps it already had. Story 9. The first time I noticed the black truck, Sarah was sleeping against the passenger window, her wedding ring catching fragments of California sunlight. We'd been driving the Pacific Coast Highway for 3 hours, and the rhythm of waves against cliffs below should have been soothing. Instead, something cold had settled in my stomach, a metallic taste that reminded me of pennies left too long in salt water. The truck had no license plate. That detail struck me immediately, though I couldn't say why it mattered. It followed at exactly the same distance, maintaining perfect spacing whether I accelerated through the winding coastal roads or slowed for the scenic overlooks that dotted Highway 1. When I changed lanes to pass a sluggish RV, the truck changed lanes. When I corrected a slight drift toward the shoulder, a mistake I hadn't even realized I'd made, the truck drifted in precisely the same way. Sarah stirred as we approached a particularly sharp curve, her eyes still heavy with sleep. She murmured something about the ocean view, but I was watching my rearview mirror, counting the seconds between my movements and the truck's identical responses. 3 seconds. Always exactly 3 seconds. The air conditioning hummed, but perspiration had begun to collect along my collar. I told myself it was the stress of honeymoon planning, the exhaustion of the wedding, the pressure of navigating unfamiliar roads. Logical explanations. But logic couldn't explain why the truck's driver remained invisible behind tinted windows, or why it never seemed to need gas despite our 4-hour journey. At the next scenic overlook, a crescent of weathered asphalt perched above churning waves, I pulled over without warning. Sarah jolted awake as gravel crunched beneath our tires. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice still thick with sleep. I watched the black truck glide past the overlook entrance, then brake sharply. It reversed with mechanical precision, backing into a parking space directly across from us. The engine fell silent, but no one emerged. "Just wanted to check something," I said, though I couldn't articulate what exactly I hoped to discover. Sarah followed my gaze to the truck, squinting against the afternoon glare. For a moment, I thought she might voice the same unease that had been building in my chest, but she only smiled and suggested we stretch our legs. The overlook's metal railings were pitted with rust, orange-brown stains spreading like infections across the galvanized steel. Salt spray hung in the air, that familiar coastal cocktail of brine and decay. I'd grown up near the ocean. I knew how quickly salt could devour metal, turning solid barriers into brittle skeletons. But the black truck remained pristine. I stood at the railing, pretending to admire the view while studying the vehicle in my peripheral vision. No rust marred its surface. No salt stains clouded its windows. Even the chrome bumper gleamed as if freshly polished, though we'd been driving through ocean spray for hours. Sarah moved beside me, her hand finding mine. Her skin was warm, real, alive, an anchor in the growing strangeness of the afternoon. She pointed out sea lions basking on distant rocks, their barks carrying on the wind like distorted laughter. I nodded and made appropriate sounds, but my attention remained fixed on the truck's impossible cleanliness. When we returned to our car, I checked the GPS while Sarah searched for a radio station that wouldn't fade in and out. The blue line of our route snaked along the coast, but something was wrong with the display. Our path and another route, presumably the truck's, intersected and curved back on themselves, forming a perfect figure eight, an infinity symbol stretching along miles of highway. My hands trembled as I zoomed in and out of the map, trying to convince myself the GPS was malfunctioning. But the symbol remained, blue and red lines intertwining in mathematical perfection. I closed the app and reopened it. The same impossible geometry stared back at me. "Find anything good?" Sarah asked, settling back into her seat with a satisfied sigh. I showed her the GPS, but she only glanced at it briefly before shrugging. The overlook had rejuvenated her. Color had returned to her cheeks, and she was humming softly, the same tune she'd hummed during our first dance 3 days ago. As we pulled back onto the highway, the black truck followed. The pattern resumed, my movements. Then 3 seconds of silence, then perfect mimicry. But now I began to notice subtleties I'd missed before. When I unconsciously adjusted my grip on the steering wheel, the truck's driver made the same adjustment. When I reached for the air conditioning controls, unseen hands in the truck reached for identical controls. The realization crept over me like cold water. The truck wasn't just following our route. It was copying my every movement, even the ones I didn't remember making. Miles blurred past in a haze of growing paranoia. The Pacific stretched endlessly to our left, its surface reflecting harsh sunlight like shattered glass. To our right, golden hills rolled toward distant mountains, beautiful and empty. But beauty meant nothing when you were being stalked by something that defied explanation. I began testing my theory with deliberate movements, a slight adjustment of the radio volume. 3 seconds later, the truck's driver made the same adjustment. A brief touch to my temple, mirrored perfectly. Even when I made obviously erroneous moves, like briefly drifting toward the wrong lane before correcting, the truck followed with mechanical precision. Sarah dozed again, lulled by the engine's rhythm and the warmth of afternoon sun through the passenger window. Her breathing was slow and even, peaceful in a way that felt increasingly foreign to me. How could she sleep when we were trapped in this impossible situation? But was it impossible? I forced myself to consider alternatives. Maybe the truck's driver was simply following the same route, making the same natural adjustments any driver would make on this winding road. Maybe the GPS was glitching, a simple software bug displaying false information. Maybe my wedding stress was manifesting as paranoid delusions. These rational thoughts provided momentary relief, but they crumbled when I noticed new details. The truck cast no reflection in the curved safety mirrors at sharp turns. Birds that roosted on roadside power lines took flight when our car approached, but remained motionless as the truck passed beneath them. And the truck's engine made no sound, not even the whisper of tires on asphalt. By the time we reached Monterey, the sun was descending toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Sarah had awakened and was excitedly planning our dinner, chattering about seafood restaurants and wine pairings, while I watched our silent shadow maintain its perfect distance. The GPS still showed that impossible infinity symbol, our routes locked in eternal intersection. But now I noticed something else. The symbol was slowly rotating, like a lazy Susan made of highways. Each mile we traveled seemed to advance our position along this mathematical nightmare, bringing us closer to what? I pulled into a gas station on the outskirts of town, hoping to break the pattern. The truck continued past the entrance, but within moments, it had found another vantage point, this time in the parking lot of a fast food restaurant across the street. Still watching, still waiting. As I filled our tank, the smell of gasoline mixed with salt air created an oddly nostalgic combination that reminded me of childhood fishing trips with my father. Normal memories from a normal life that felt increasingly distant. The gas pump's digital display scrolled through numbers with mechanical regularity. Dollars and gallons, cause and effect, simple mathematics. But when I glanced across the street, the truck's driver wasn't at a gas pump. The vehicle sat motionless, engine silent, requiring no fuel. Just as it seemed to require nothing else. No visible driver, no license plate, no acknowledgement of physical laws that governed everything else in this world. Sarah emerged from the station's convenience store with bottled water and snacks, her mood still bright and untroubled. She'd always been the optimistic one in our relationship, finding silver linings where I saw only clouds. It was one of the things I loved about her, but now her cheerfulness felt almost surreal, as if she existed in a different reality, one where phantom trucks and impossible GPS displays were merely quirks to be ignored. We drove through Monterey as twilight deepened, the truck maintaining its vigil. Sarah pointed out restaurants and shops, making plans for the following day when we'd explore Carmel and perhaps visit the aquarium. Her voice carried the excited anticipation of a new bride on her honeymoon, but it seemed to reach me from across a vast distance. At our hotel, a charming Victorian overlooking the bay, I found myself checking the windows repeatedly while Sarah unpacked. The truck was nowhere visible from our room, but that only increased my anxiety. Where was it? Where did it go when not actively following us? That night, I lay awake listening to waves crash against the rocky shoreline below. Sarah slept peacefully beside me, her breathing soft and regular, occasionally murmuring fragments of dreams I couldn't interpret. But sleep evaded me as my mind raced through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. What if the truck was a manifestation of my own subconscious fears about marriage? What if the stress of committing to another person had fractured my perception of reality? What if I was slowly losing my mind, and Sarah was too polite or frightened to acknowledge my deteriorating mental state? These psychological explanations felt almost comforting compared to the alternative, that something genuinely supernatural was occurring, something that defied rational understanding. But in the pre-dawn darkness, with fog rolling in from the Pacific and seagulls crying like lost souls, the supernatural seemed entirely possible. Morning brought no relief. The truck was waiting in the hotel parking lot when we checked out, positioned with clear sightlines to the lobby entrance. It had somehow anticipated our location, our schedule, our very thoughts. As we resumed our journey south toward Big Sur, the pattern continued with increased intensity. Every unconscious gesture, every automatic adjustment, every involuntary movement was mirrored with that same 3-second delay. But now I began to notice that the delay was shortening. 3 seconds became 2, then 1.5, as if whatever controlled the truck was learning, adapting, preparing for something. The GPS display had evolved as well. The infinity symbol now pulsed with a subtle rhythm that matched my heartbeat, and new details had appeared. Timestamps, coordinates, mathematical formulas I didn't recognize. It was as if the device was documenting our journey according to parameters that existed outside normal space and time. Sarah seemed oblivious to these developments, chattering about the dramatic coastline and stopping occasionally to take photographs. But I noticed that in every picture where the truck should have been visible in the background, the frame was empty. The truck existed in my peripheral vision, in my mirrors, in my growing terror, but never in direct observation or photographic evidence. This realization brought a new horror. If the truck wasn't visible to cameras, was it visible to anyone but me? Was Sarah's calm demeanor not a sign of optimism, but evidence that she couldn't see our pursuer at all? I tested this theory by pointing out the truck during one of our stops, but Sarah's gaze passed over it without recognition. She saw the parking lot, the other vehicles, the scenic overlook, but not the black truck that dominated my field of vision. "What truck, honey?" she asked with genuine confusion, and I realized that my isolation was complete. The revelation should have been liberating. Proof that this was psychological rather than supernatural. Evidence that I needed help rather than an exorcist. But instead, it deepened my despair. If the truck existed only in my perception, Then my grip on reality was more tenuous than I'd imagined. Yet the GPS continued displaying its impossible mathematics, and the truck's movements remained perfectly synchronized with mine. Whatever was happening existed at the intersection of psychology and physics, where cause and effect twisted into new configurations. As afternoon descended, we approached the section of highway where our journey had begun. The truck had been following us for over 24 hours, and I'd begun to suspect that time itself was bending around our route. The same landmarks appeared repeatedly: a distinctive rock formation, a weathered billboard, a cluster of cypress trees bent by constant wind. But these weren't similar landmarks. They were identical, down to the smallest detail. We were somehow traveling in a loop, trapped within the infinity symbol that pulsed on my GPS screen. Each circuit brought us back to the same point, the same moment, the same creeping realization that escape was impossible. Sarah remained blissfully unaware of our circular journey, treating each repetition as a new experience. Her enthusiasm never flagged, her observations never repeated. She existed in linear time while I was caught in an endless spiral, watching the same scenes unfold with mounting horror. The truck's delay had disappeared entirely. Now it moved in perfect synchronization with our car, as if both vehicles were controlled by the same invisible hand. When I turned the steering wheel, it turned simultaneously. When I pressed the brake, it responded instantly. We had become a single entity, two parts of the same nightmare machine. And still, the salt air continued to corrode everything except the truck. Metal railings crumbled to rust, road signs became illegible, even our own car began showing signs of accelerated decay. Paint peeled from the hood, chrome bumpers developed brown stains, rubber seals around the windows grew brittle and cracked. But the black truck remained pristine, untouched by time or chemistry. It was the eye of the storm, the stable center around which everything else deteriorated. Not immune to corrosion, it was corrosion, the force that aged everything else while remaining eternally unchanged. Understanding brought no comfort, only deeper terror. We were trapped in a temporal loop powered by entropy itself, destined to drive this coastal highway until the road crumbled beneath our wheels, and the ocean claimed what remained. The truck wasn't following us. It was leading us, drawing us deeper into its reality where physics bent to accommodate impossible geometry. Sarah's hand found mine as we crested a familiar hill, her touch warm and reassuring despite everything. She was real, I knew that much. Her love was real. Our marriage was real. The future we'd planned together was real. But none of that mattered if we couldn't escape this endless circuit, this figure-8 highway that existed outside normal time. The truck had become our shadow, and shadows, I realized with growing despair, only disappear when their source is extinguished. As twilight approached for what might have been the 1,000th time, I began to understand the true nature of our prison. The only way to break the cycle was to complete it, to drive until the infinity symbol closed upon itself, until the mathematics of our route reached their logical conclusion. But what waited at that conclusion? Freedom? Or something far worse? The truck maintained its silent vigil as we drove into another identical sunset, its presence both threat and promise. Soon, I knew, we would discover whether this was the end of our story, or merely the beginning of a longer, darker journey through landscapes that existed only in the space between heartbeats, in the pause between one moment and the next. The GPS pulsed with increasing urgency, counting down to something I couldn't name but felt approaching like a tide. And in my rearview mirror, the black truck followed with mechanical precision, patient as entropy, inevitable as time itself. Story 10. The silence began on Tuesday. Sarah's departure should have felt routine. Another 3-week consulting trip to Phoenix. Another stretch of bachelor living in our suburban Connecticut home. But the house felt different this time, as if her absence had somehow altered its fundamental architecture. Corners seemed sharper. Shadows lingered longer than they should. Even the familiar creak of settling wood sounded foreign, almost accusatory. The first Polaroid arrived on Thursday morning. I found it slipped beneath the front door, the white border still crisp against the hardwood floor. The image showed our living room from an impossible angle, somewhere near the ceiling, looking down at a figure seated in my reading chair. The figure wore my clothes, my posture, my thinning hairline, but I had no memory of sitting there. In the photo, this other version of myself held a book I didn't recognize, its cover obscured by shadow and distance. Attached to the back with medical tape was a small card bearing typed text, Phase 1 test, Subject 17, baseline documentation. My hands trembled as I examined the Polaroid under the kitchen light. The photographic paper felt authentic, slightly warm as if recently ejected from a camera. The timestamp in the corner read 2:34 a.m., a time when I would have been deep in sleep. Yet there I was, apparently reading in the dark living room. I told myself it was a prank, perhaps some elaborate joke orchestrated by my brother David, who still harbored resentment about our father's will. But David lived in Oregon, knew nothing about Polaroid cameras, and lacked the technical sophistication for such an elaborate hoax. The second photo arrived Friday. This one showed me standing in the kitchen, back turned to the camera, appearing to prepare food I had never cooked. On the counter lay ingredients I didn't recognize, exotic spices, unfamiliar vegetables arranged in precise patterns. The timestamp read 4:17 a.m. The attached note, Phase 2 test, Subject 17, behavioral adaptation. I began checking the locks obsessively, installing additional deadbolts on both the front and back doors. I searched every room for hidden cameras, examining light fixtures, smoke detectors, electrical outlets. Nothing. The house remained stubbornly normal, offering no explanations for its photographic documentation of my non-existent activities. Sleep became elusive. I found myself lying awake, listening for the soft mechanical whir of a Polaroid camera, for footsteps that never came. The house's natural sounds amplified in the darkness. The refrigerator's hum, the furnace cycling, the subtle expansion and contraction of wood and metal. Each noise seemed laden with potential threat. By Saturday, paranoia had carved deep grooves in my consciousness. I installed motion sensors in every hallway, connected to an app on my phone that would alert me to any movement. The sensors detected nothing unusual, yet Sunday morning brought another Polaroid. This photograph captured me in Sarah's home office, hunched over her computer. The screen's glow illuminated my face with unnatural blue light, revealing an expression of intense concentration I had never seen in any mirror. The timestamp, 3:52 a.m. The note, Phase 3. Test, Subject 17, information integration. I had never used Sarah's computer. Her password remained unknown to me, our digital lives deliberately separate at her insistence. Yet the photo showed me apparently absorbed in some task that required her specific access. The details in each image felt impossibly precise. I could identify the exact brand of my pajamas, the specific angle of my shoulders, the particular way my hair fell across my forehead. These were not digital manipulations or clever composites. They were authentic photographs of events that had never occurred. Monday brought 2 Polaroids. The first showed me descending into our basement, carrying what appeared to be a complex electronic device. The second captured me installing this device near the furnace, its LED indicators casting strange shadows on the concrete walls. Both timestamps fell within a 20-minute window around 2 a.m. The notes read, Phase 4 test, Subject 17, infrastructure modification, and Phase 5 test, Subject 17, system integration. I had never been in the basement during the night. I had never seen the device shown in the photographs. Yet when I descended the stairs that Monday evening, there it was. A sleek black box mounted exactly where the photo indicated, its green LEDs pulsing in a hypnotic rhythm. My first instinct was to remove the device, but something stopped me. The installation appeared professional, integrated into our electrical system with surgical precision. Removing it might trigger consequences I couldn't anticipate. Instead, I photographed it with my phone, documenting every angle, every connection, every indicator light. That night, I forced myself to remain awake, positioned in the living room with a clear view of all entrances. I armed the motion sensors, activated the security system, and maintained vigilant watch. At 1:47 a.m., Exhaustion finally overwhelmed me. Tuesday's Polaroid showed me sleeping in the living room chair, the camera positioned mere feet from where I had dozed. The note simply read, Phase 6 test, Subject 17, surveillance confirmation. Someone had stood within arm's reach while I slept, close enough to capture my unconscious vulnerability. The violation felt absolute, intimate in its clinical detachment. They had studied my face, documented my defenselessness, reduced my humanity to another data point in their incomprehensible protocol. I called the police, but the responding officer treated the situation with polite skepticism. The photographs were real, he acknowledged, but proved nothing criminal. No signs of forced entry, no missing property, no explicit threats. His report would be filed, he assured me, but investigation resources were limited for cases involving probable domestic pranks. Sarah's return was still a week away. The house felt increasingly foreign, its familiar spaces contaminated by the presence of unknown observers. I began sleeping in different rooms each night, varying my routines, attempting to disrupt whatever pattern they were documenting. Wednesday's Polaroid showed me doing exactly that. Moving between rooms, checking locks, peering through windows with paranoid intensity. The note, Phase 7 test, Subject 17, adaptive countermeasures. They were always one step ahead, anticipating my responses before I made them. The realization that my defensive behaviors were themselves part of their study induced a peculiar form of psychological paralysis. Every action felt predetermined, every choice illusory. Thursday brought no Polaroid, and the absence proved more unsettling than their presence. I found myself checking the door repeatedly, almost disappointed when no white rectangle appeared. The break-in pattern suggested escalation, a transition to some new phase of their protocol. Friday confirmed my fears. The Polaroid showed me in a location I had never seen, a narrow staircase leading upward, lined with rough wooden boards and exposed beams. The lighting was different, older, suggesting a hidden space within our house's structure. The note read, Phase 8 test, Subject 17, Discovery Protocol initiated. I spent hours examining our home's architecture, measuring rooms against external dimensions, searching for hidden spaces. The house was built in 1962, its layout straightforward and conventional. No room for secret passages or concealed chambers. Then I noticed the anomaly in the hallway ceiling, a section where the paint looked newer, where tiny nail holes suggested a recently removed access panel. Standing on a chair, I pressed gently against the ceiling tiles until one shifted, revealing a narrow opening into darkness above. The attic access led not to a conventional storage space, but to a finished room I had never known existed. The staircase from the Polaroid led upward into this hidden chamber, its walls lined with equipment I couldn't identify. Monitors displayed scrolling data, cameras focused on various angles throughout our house, and in the center of the room stood two figures that challenged every assumption about reality's fundamental nature. They appeared human at first glance, but their edges shimmered with translucent instability. Holographic projections, I realized, but impossibly detailed, possessed of substance and shadow that defied my understanding of optical technology. As I climbed the final steps, they turned to face me with expressions of weary familiarity. The first figure spoke, its voice carrying the unmistakable cadence of my own speech patterns. It claimed to be a future version of myself, transmitted backward through temporal mechanics I couldn't comprehend. The second figure nodded in agreement, introducing itself as an alternate timeline iteration, existing parallel to my current reality. Their explanation unfolded with clinical precision. They described a catastrophic event, a complete psychological collapse that occurred in my original timeline, triggered by Sarah's permanent departure and my inability to process the abandonment. The breakdown had been so severe, so absolute, that it created ripples through adjacent realities, threatening the stability of multiple timeline branches. These holographic versions represented attempts to prevent that collapse, to guide my actions along paths that would preserve both my sanity and our marriage. The Polaroids documented necessary interventions, showing me actions I needed to perform to maintain timeline stability. Each photograph was both prophecy and instruction. I must recreate these scenes exactly, in the precise sequence they had been revealed. Failure to comply would create a divergent timeline where both Sarah and I would lose our identities completely. Not death, they emphasized, but something worse. The total erasure of everything that made us who we were, leaving only hollow shells mimicking life without substance or memory. The first hologram gestured toward a bank of monitors showing Sarah's hotel room in Phoenix. She appeared to be sleeping peacefully, unaware that her existence hung in balance. The second hologram explained that she would return home in 3 days, and by then, all 8 phases of the test protocol must be completed in perfect sequence. They handed me a Polaroid camera, an ancient SX-70 model that felt surprisingly solid for equipment provided by temporal projections. My instructions were simple. Recreate each photographed scene at the exact time indicated, allowing the camera to document my compliance. The holographic observers would monitor my performance, making subtle adjustments to prevent timeline divergence. But something in their explanations felt wrong, inconsistent. If they were truly future versions of myself, why did their mannerisms feel foreign? Why did their knowledge of our house include details I was certain Sarah and I had never shared with anyone? And most disturbing, why did they occasionally glance at each other with expressions that suggested deception? I descended from the hidden room with the camera, my mind reeling between acceptance and skepticism. The Polaroids lay scattered across the kitchen table like tarot cards predicting an unwelcome future. Each image showed actions I had never taken, in sequences that felt both inevitable and impossible. The rational part of my consciousness insisted this was elaborate delusion, a psychological break triggered by isolation and marital stress. The paranoid sections whispered about government experiments, corporate surveillance, or elaborate gaslighting campaigns designed to drive me insane. But the Polaroids remained tangible, undeniable evidence of something beyond conventional explanation. As evening approached, I stood before the reading chair where the first photograph had been taken. The holographic camera felt warm in my hands, its mechanisms clicking with mechanical precision. If I followed their instructions, I would be acknowledging the reality of temporal interference and accepting responsibility for timeline preservation. If I refused, I risked either psychological collapse or the complete dissolution of everything I valued. The choice felt simultaneously momentous and meaningless. Perhaps that distinction itself was just another layer of the test protocol. At 2:34 a.m., I sat in the chair and opened an unfamiliar book, feeling the camera's flash illuminate my compliance. The Polaroid ejected with a satisfied mechanical whisper, its image slowly developing in the darkness. There I was, captured in perfect recreation of the first photograph, locked into a sequence of events I couldn't fully understand or completely reject. 7 more phases remained. Sarah would return home soon, unaware that her identity might depend on my precise performance in this inexplicable theater of temporal maintenance. Whether the holographic observers were future selves, alien anthropologists, or fragments of my own disintegrating psyche seemed increasingly irrelevant compared to the simple fact of their continued presence. The Polaroids had become my scripture, their timestamps my schedule for salvation or damnation. And in the darkness of our familiar home, I began the careful work of becoming someone I had never been, guided by images of actions I had never taken, for purposes I could never fully comprehend. The silence had not begun on Tuesday after all. It had been building for years, waiting for the precise moment when isolation and possibility would converge, when the boundary between documentation and reality would blur beyond recognition. The Polaroids were not invasions of my privacy. They were invitations to step outside the comfortable illusion of linear time and discover what versions of myself might be possible. Whether I was saving my marriage or destroying my sanity remained to be seen. But in that moment, holding the warm photograph of my own impossible compliance, I understood that the distinction might be less important than I had originally believed. The test protocol would continue. Phase 2 awaited. Story 11. The watch had stopped ticking 3 miles back. I pressed my thumb against the crystal face of my grandfather's Omega, feeling for the familiar vibration that had accompanied me through 15 years of wilderness expeditions. Nothing. The hands frozen at 3:17, though whether morning or afternoon, I couldn't tell anymore. The Oregon forest had swallowed the sun hours ago, leaving only the perpetual twilight that seeps between ancient Douglas firs like spilled ink. The cabin materialized from the gloom as if the trees themselves had exhaled it into existence. Weathered cedar planks, silver gray with age, formed walls that seemed to lean inward with the weight of decades. No smoke rose from the chimney, no light flickered behind the dark windows, yet something about its stillness felt deliberate, expectant, like a held breath waiting to be released. My boots squelched against the sodden earth as I approached. The Portland Weather Service had promised clear skies, but the mist had been thickening since noon, transforming my planned day hike into a navigation nightmare. Now, with darkness pressing against the tree line and my GPS showing nothing but static, this abandoned shelter felt like salvation. The porch boards groaned a warning as I stepped onto them. The front door stood slightly ajar, revealing only deeper blackness beyond. I called out, my voice swallowed immediately by the oppressive silence. No echo returned from within. Inside, dust motes danced in the pale beam of my flashlight. The cabin's interior was sparse. A stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs arranged as if their occupants had just stepped away for a moment. But it was the smell that made my skin crawl. Not the expected mustiness of abandonment, but something sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. I was examining the stone hearth when I noticed the irregularity in the floor. One section of the wide plank flooring didn't quite align with the rest. When I knelt and pressed against it, the board shifted with a soft click. A hidden mechanism released, and a 3-foot square of floor swung downward on concealed hinges, revealing stairs descending into absolute darkness. The sweet smell grew stronger, rising from below like an exhalation from some underground garden. My flashlight beam probed downward but failed to find the bottom. The stairs appeared to be carved from the same gray stone as the fireplace, worn smooth by countless footsteps. Moisture beaded on the walls, catching my light in diamond droplets. I should have left. Should have climbed back through that trapdoor and stumbled through the forest until dawn. Instead, I found myself placing 1 foot on the topmost step. The stone was warm beneath my boot sole, as if heated from within. The first painting appeared after I'd descended perhaps a dozen steps. Mounted in an ornate brass frame, it depicted a man in colonial dress, tricorn hat, high-collared coat, brass buttons. But it was his wrist that made my breath catch. There, painted with meticulous detail, was my grandfather's watch. The same silver case, the same leather band worn soft at the edges, even the tiny scratch near the crown that I'd made with a penknife as a child. I backed up to examine the painting more closely, but when I turned, the step I'd just descended was gone. Solid stone wall met my flashlight beam where an opening should have been. The stairs below continued their spiral descent, but behind me lay only carved rock. Panic fluttered in my chest like a trapped bird. I pressed my palms against the stone, searching for seams, for any indication of a hidden door. The surface remained unyielding, its temperature uncomfortably warm against my skin. When I looked down again, the stairs curved away into darkness, following a spiral path that my light couldn't fully illuminate. The second painting waited 20 steps below. This one showed a woman in Victorian dress, her dark hair pinned beneath a mourning bonnet. Her pale hand rested on a table, and there, unmistakably, was my watch. The same timepiece that now pressed against my wrist with its familiar weight. My fingers fumbled for the watch face, checking the time out of habit. Still 3:17. Had it been 3:17 when I'd first entered the cabin? I couldn't remember. Memory felt slippery here, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. The stairs continued their descent. More paintings appeared at irregular intervals. A Union soldier, a flapper from the 1920s, a man in a zoot suit, a woman in a flower-power dress. Each figure wore clothing appropriate to their era, but every single one displayed my grandfather's watch. The faces changed, the clothes evolved, but that silver timepiece remained constant across decades of portrayed time. With each step downward, another step vanished behind me. The spiral tightened as it descended, forcing me closer to the outer wall where the paintings hung. I began to notice details I'd missed before. The way each subject's eyes seemed to track my movement, how their expressions shifted subtly when viewed from different angles. In the gaslight glow of my flashlight, they appeared to breathe. The voice reached me when I'd lost count of both steps and paintings. "You're admiring the collection." The words emerged from speakers hidden somewhere in the stone walls. A woman's voice with the crystalline clarity of someone accustomed to being heard. Not young, but not elderly either. Ageless in the way that suggested long familiarity with this place. I stopped walking, pressing my back against the curved wall. "Who's there? How do I get out?" "The gallery has been growing for quite some time," she continued, ignoring my questions. "Each edition brings its own unique perspective. You'll notice they all share something in common." My eyes moved to the nearest painting, a jazz-age musician with slicked-back hair and suspenders. The watch glinted on his wrist like an accusation. "This is impossible," I whispered, but the stone walls threw my words back with mocking clarity. "Time is more fluid than most people understand," the voice said. "Your particular timepiece has an interesting history. It's traveled further than you might expect." I looked down at my grandfather's watch, its dead face reflecting my flashlight beam. He'd worn it during World War II, had passed it to my father, who'd given it to me when I graduated college. A family heirloom with a documented provenance. How could it appear in paintings that predated its existence? "I want to leave," I said to the darkness. "Of course you do. The exit is quite simple, really. Just ahead, you'll find what you need." The stairs opened into a circular chamber about 15 feet across. The walls here were lined with paintings, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, stretching up into shadows my light couldn't penetrate. All the faces of people throughout history, all wearing the same impossible watch. In the center of the room sat an antique camera on a wooden tripod. Not the sleek modern equipment I was familiar with, but something from the early days of photography. Brass fittings, leather bellows, glass plates. Beside it, an ornate mirror reflected my own face back at me, pale and drawn in the harsh LED glare. "The process is quite straightforward," the voice explained. "Simply replace one of the existing portraits with your own. The camera is prepared, the chemicals are fresh. All you need to do is take your place in the collection." I approached the camera slowly, noting the brass nameplate mounted on its front. Watson & Sons, London, 1887. The glass plate was already loaded, waiting. When I peered through the viewfinder, I saw my own reflection in the mirror, framed perfectly within the camera's perspective. "And if I refuse?" "Then you continue walking. The stairs go down much further than you might imagine. Most people forget what they're looking for by the time they reach the bottom. They forget why they started descending. Eventually, they forget the face they were meant to photograph." I studied the paintings surrounding me, searching for any clue about their subject's ultimate fate. The colonial gentleman stared back with eyes that held no recognition, no sense of self. The Victorian woman's gaze was similarly empty, beautiful, but hollow. They all appeared to be waiting for something they could no longer remember. "How long have they been here?" I asked. Time moves differently in this place. Some have been walking for minutes, others for decades. The spiral has no true beginning or end. My grandfather's watch felt heavier against my wrist. I tried to remove it, to examine it more closely, but the leather band wouldn't budge. It had fused with my skin somehow, becoming part of me in a way that should have been impossible. "The watch chooses its bearer," the voice said, as if reading my thoughts. "It's been waiting for you specifically. You're the culmination of a very long journey." "Journey to where?" "To here. To this moment. To the choice you're about to make." I looked around the chamber again, counting the paintings. 37 visible faces, all wearing my watch, all trapped in their individual moments of decision. Had they all stood in the same spot, faced with this same impossible choice? "What happens if I take the photograph?" "You join the collection. Your image becomes part of the permanent gallery, and someone else inherits the watch. And they eventually end up here too." Eventually, the camera waited, its brass fittings gleaming in my flashlight beam. The mirror reflected my face with uncomfortable clarity, showing me details I didn't want to see. The way my eyes had developed a hunted look, how my skin had taken on the same pallor as the painted subjects around me. I could feel the stares calling from behind me, promising an endless descent into forgetting. The spiral wound downward through stone and darkness, offering the mercy of amnesia to those who couldn't make the choice. How many others had chosen that path? How many nameless figures wandered the lower reaches, their faces blank, their purpose erased? But there was something else, something the voice hadn't mentioned. I'd noticed it in the paintings, a subtle difference in the eyes of some subjects compared to others. Most stared out with that empty, waiting expression. But a few, the jazz musician, a woman in 1940s dress, a teenager from what looked like the 1980s, seemed more alert, more present, as if some part of them remained aware. "Not everyone forgets completely," I said. The voice was quiet for several moments. "No," she finally admitted. "Some retain enough of themselves to serve as guides. Like you. Like me." I looked at my reflection in the mirror again. The man staring back had my face, my features, but something in his expression reminded me of the alert subjects in the paintings, a quality of patient waiting, of eternal vigilance. The chemical smell from the camera's developing tray grew stronger, mixing with that sweet floral scent I'd noticed in the cabin above. Together they created an odor like a funeral parlor, flowers and formaldehyde, beauty and preservation. My finger hovered over the camera's shutter release. One click would freeze this moment forever, add my face to the collection, and send my grandfather's watch on to its next bearer. The alternative was the endless spiral, the gradual erosion of self until nothing remained but the impulse to keep walking. But there was a third option, wasn't there? I could see it in the positioning of the camera, in the angle of the mirror. The photograph would capture not just my image, but my reflection, showing both my face and the back of my head simultaneously. A temporal paradox frozen in silver and glass. "You're thinking of something clever," the voice observed. "They often do. And if I am? Cleverness has its own consequences. The collection doesn't appreciate disruption." I studied the paintings one more time, looking for clues in their arrangement. Some hung higher than others. Some were grouped together while others stood alone. And there, in the shadows near the ceiling, I could just make out empty frames, spaces waiting to be filled. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. It was an invitation to become part of something larger, something that transcended individual existence. The watch would continue its journey through time, marking moments and collecting bearers, until every frame was filled and the spiral reached its intended completion. I raised the camera to my eye and adjusted the focus until my reflection appeared crisp and clear in the viewfinder. My finger rested on the shutter release, feeling the tension of the spring mechanism beneath my touch. Somewhere in the darkness above, I could hear the faint sound of footsteps on wooden planks. Someone else had found the cabin. Someone else was about to discover the hidden entrance to this spiral gallery. The watch on my wrist began to tick again, its mechanical heartbeat counting down to 3:18. I pressed the shutter. The flash illuminated the chamber for one brilliant instant, revealing details I hadn't noticed before. The paintings weren't just portraits, they were windows. Behind each frame, I caught glimpses of the subjects in their moments of choice, forever frozen at the instant of decision. And in that flash, I understood. We weren't trapped here. We were guardians, each watching over our own era of the spiral, ensuring that the pattern continued. The watch would find its way to another wrist, and that person would eventually find their way here, to this chamber, to this choice. As the developing chemicals began their work, I felt my reflection settling into the glass plate, becoming permanent. The voice that had guided me here faded, replaced by my own understanding of what came next. Above, the footsteps grew closer to the trapdoor. I took my place among the painted watchers and waited for the next visitor to descend the spiral stairs. My grandfather's watch gleamed silver on my wrist as time moved forward, carrying its burden toward another moment of impossible choice. The spiral continues its descent, and I am both its guardian and its prisoner, watching over those who come after me as others watched over me. In the eternal twilight of this place, memory and forgetting dance together, and the only constant is the gentle ticking of a watch that has traveled farther through time than any timepiece should. The next bearer approaches, the collection grows, and I wait, patient and eternal, for the moment when understanding blooms in another's eyes and they realize that some choices echo through time itself, binding us all to the endless, beautiful spiral of existence. Story 12. The first time I heard the footsteps with no body attached, I convinced myself it was just the forest playing tricks. After 15 years guiding survival groups through the Amapá National Forest, you learn to distinguish between the sounds that matter and the ones that don't. But these steps, heavy, deliberate, circling our campsite in the pre-dawn darkness, they didn't belong to any animal I knew. I pressed my ear against the damp earth, feeling the vibrations travel through my bones. The pattern was wrong, too measured, too human. Yet whenever I swept my flashlight across the undergrowth, nothing reflected back except the familiar gleam of spider eyes and the occasional startled bird. That was 3 days ago, before the poachers found me. Before I learned about the thing they called brilho oco, the hollow glow. Now, bound with zip ties and sitting against a mahogany trunk whose bark scraped against my spine like sandpaper, I watched my captors prepare their trap. The leader, a weathered man with scars crossing his forearms like a roadmap of violence, had explained their plan with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. They needed bait. Something that understood the forest well enough to lure their prize into the open. The thing they hunted wasn't exactly an animal, he'd said. More like a light that had learned to think, to move with purpose through the canopy. It appeared as a brilliant orb, larger than any firefly, pulsing with an inner radiance that could be seen from half a mile away. But getting close enough to capture it, that was the challenge. The hollow glow had a defense mechanism that went beyond simple flight. "It gets into your head," the scarred man had murmured, his fingers absently tracing the edge of a tranquilizer gun. "Makes you lose your way. Some say it feeds on direction itself, leaves you wandering in circles until you're too weak to continue. But that's not the worst part. The worst part," he'd explained, "was what happened to anyone who stared directly into the light. They lost something fundamental, their ability to perceive color. Not temporarily, but forever. The world became a landscape of grays and shadows, as if the creature had stolen some essential part of their vision and kept it for itself. I'd seen the evidence in his team. 3 men moved around the makeshift camp with the careful precision of people navigating a world drained of vibrancy. They functioned normally, but there was something vacant in their eyes, as if they were looking through the world rather than at it. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, a man who'd spent his career teaching people to navigate by natural landmarks and celestial positions, reduced to human bait for something that stole the very sense of direction it relied on. As night descended, the forest came alive with its usual symphony. Howler monkeys called from the distant canopy, their voices echoing through the humid air like the screams of lost souls. Closer to our position, the steady rhythm of cicadas created a white noise that made it impossible to distinguish approaching footsteps from the general cacophony of jungle life. But then, just after midnight, silence fell like a curtain dropping. The sudden absence of sound was more unsettling than any noise. Even the ever-present hum of mosquitoes seemed to fade, leaving only the thud of my own heartbeat and the shallow breathing of the men around me. One of them, a younger poacher with calloused hands and nervous eyes that still held traces of blue, gripped his equipment tighter and whispered something that sounded like a prayer. That's when I saw it. A pinprick of light danced between the trees about 50 yards away, bobbing with an almost playful movement that reminded me of a child's balloon caught in a gentle breeze. But there was no wind, and the light pulsed with a rhythm that seemed too deliberate to be natural. The scarred leader raised his hand, signaling for silence, though none of us were making any sound. The light continued its approach, weaving between trunks with impossible grace, never quite following a straight path, but somehow always moving closer to our position. As it drew nearer, I began to understand what the poachers meant about losing direction. Looking at the hollow glow was like trying to focus on a mirage. The harder you concentrated, the more it seemed to slip away from the center of your vision. My internal compass, honed by years of wilderness navigation, started spinning wildly. North became south, east merged with west, and the familiar landmarks I'd used to orient myself dissolved into meaninglessness. But I forced myself to look away, to focus on the ground, on my breathing, on anything except that hypnotic radiance. The men around me weren't so fortunate. One by one, they began to sway, their faces slack with concentration as they stared into the approaching light. The scarred leader fought it the longest, but even he eventually succumbed, his tranquilizer gun dropping from nerveless fingers as his pupils dilated to accommodate something that shouldn't exist. The light came closer, and with it came the sound of footsteps. Not the careful padding of boots on forest floor, but something heavier, more deliberate. Yet when I risked a glance at the ground beneath the floating orb, there was nothing there. The steps echoed from empty air, as if the creature cast an auditory shadow without the substance to create it. I could feel it studying me, though it had no eyes I could discern. The sensation was like being examined by a consciousness that operated on wavelengths beyond human perception. My skin prickled with electric awareness, and I had to resist the urge to look directly at the source of that overwhelming presence. That's when the plan came to me, and 30 yards to my left, barely visible in the creature's reflected glow, lay a small depression in the earth that filled with rainwater during the wet season. Now, in the dry period, it held only a shallow pool, just enough to create a mirror surface under the right conditions. Working by feel, I managed to edge the zip ties down to a sharp piece of broken stone behind the tree. The plastic cut into my wrists as I sawed through the restraints, but the pain kept me focused, kept me from falling under the hollow glow's influence. The men around me stood like statues, their eyes reflecting the creature's light in ways that suggested they were seeing something I couldn't or wouldn't let myself see. Their faces had taken on an expression of profound loss, as if they were watching the colors drain from their world in real time. Once free, I crawled toward the water depression, keeping my gaze fixed on the muddy ground, and using my peripheral vision to track the creature's movement. The footsteps followed, always maintaining the same distance, as if the hollow glow understood my intentions, but was curious enough to let the game play out. The pool was smaller than I'd hoped, barely 2 feet across, but the surface was still enough to catch and hold reflections. I positioned myself at one edge, and for the first time since seeing the creature, allowed myself to look directly at it. The experience was like staring into a collapsing star. The light didn't just illuminate, it pulled, drawing something essential from my vision and replacing it with an aching emptiness. Colors began to leach from my perception, the greens of the forest fading to gray, the blue-black of the night sky becoming a uniform slate. But in the water below, something else was happening. The reflection wasn't quite right. Where the creature showed only light in the physical world, its mirror image revealed something more substantial, a shape that was almost human, but stretched and distorted, as if someone had taken a person and twisted them into a configuration that hurt to contemplate. The hollow glow paused in its approach, its pulsing rhythm disrupted by uncertainty. It had noticed the reflection too, and for the first time since its appearance, it seemed confused by what it was seeing. I held my breath, fighting against the urge to look away as my color vision continued to deteriorate. The creature drifted closer to the water, drawn by its own reflected image like a cat approaching a mirror for the first time. When it finally looked down into the pool, the forest exploded with light. The brilliance was so intense that it penetrated my closed eyelids, turning my vision white-hot for several seconds. When the after images faded and I could see again, The hollow glow was gone. In its place, the water showed only the reflection of stars and the gentle movement of disturbed surface tension. The men around me began to stir, blinking in confusion as if waking from a deep sleep. But their eyes, when they turned to look at each other, held the flat emptiness of permanent color blindness. They would navigate the world in shades of gray for the rest of their lives, a living reminder of what they'd encountered in the forest. As for me, I found I could still distinguish colors, though they seemed muted somehow, as if filtered through gauze. The green of the leaves looked less vibrant, the brown of the earth less rich. It was as if the creature had taken just enough to mark me as one of its own without completely claiming my vision. The poachers left without a word, gathering their equipment with the mechanical movements of people trying to process an experience beyond their understanding. They didn't attempt to secure me again. What would be the point? We'd all been changed by what we'd witnessed. I made my way back to the ranger station 3 days later, following familiar trails that somehow felt different beneath my feet. My supervisor listened to my report with the polite skepticism reserved for people who'd spent too much time alone in the wilderness. Illegal poaching, yes. Dangerous conditions, certainly. But a creature made of light that stole color vision? That would stay off the official record. But I know what I saw, what I felt, what I lost in that water reflection. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I still hear those footsteps circling my cabin. Measured, deliberate, impossibly present despite the absence of anybody to create them. And sometimes when I catch my reflection in still water, I wonder if what I see looking back is entirely human anymore. The features are right, the proportions correct, but there's something in the eyes that wasn't there before, a quality of light that seems borrowed from somewhere else, as if I'd become a conduit for something that shouldn't exist. The forest holds its secrets close, and some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. But late at night, when the darkness feels especially deep and the jungle sounds fade to unnatural silence, I find myself questioning which side of the mirror I'm really on. The hollow glow is still out there. I'm certain of it. Waiting, watching, learning from those brief moments when it saw its own reflection and recognized something familiar in the distorted image staring back. And I can't shake the feeling that when it looked into that water, it didn't just see itself, it saw me. Story 13. The interstate stretched ahead like a black tongue licking at the horizon, and I should have kept driving past the hitchhiker. Should have pressed harder on the accelerator when I saw him standing at the on-ramp outside Napa, thumb extended toward the Nevada darkness. But 23 years of hauling freight had taught me that the road gets lonely enough to make questionable decisions seem reasonable. He stood beneath the flickering streetlight with a worn leather satchel clutched against his chest, the kind doctors carried in old movies. Thin as a rail, maybe 40, with fingers that moved constantly, tapping, flexing, practicing some invisible routine. When my 18-wheeler's air brakes hissed to a stop beside him, he climbed into the cab without a word, settling the satchel carefully between his feet like it contained something precious and fragile. The wine crates behind us shifted slightly as we merged back onto I-80, their wooden frames creaking against the tie-downs. I'd been hauling this particular load from a small Napa vineyard to a casino in Reno for 3 years running. Same route, same cargo. Routine had always been my friend, until tonight. My passenger introduced himself only as Doc, which seemed fitting given the medical bag. He had pale, surgical clean hands and eyes that never quite looked directly at me, always slightly past my shoulder or just above my head, as if reading something written on the air behind me. The cab's interior lights caught the shine of his scalp through thinning hair, and I noticed he kept glancing at the rearview mirrors with an expression I couldn't quite place. Hunger mixed with revulsion. About 30 miles out of Napa, he started covering the mirrors. First, the passenger side mirror, pulling a black cloth from his satchel and draping it carefully over the glass surface. Then the main rearview mirror above the windshield. His movements were precise, practiced, like a ritual he'd performed countless times. When I asked what he was doing, he offered only that reflections made him uncomfortable, that they showed too much of what shouldn't be seen. The lack of mirrors bothered me more than I'd expected. 23 years of driving had programmed my eyes to check them every few seconds, a survival instinct as natural as breathing. Now I felt blind, cut off from the world behind us. The sensation crawled along my spine like cold fingers, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel harder than necessary. Doc sat quietly for the next hour, occasionally reaching into his satchel to touch something inside, something that clinked softly, metal against metal. The sound made my teeth ache, reminded me of dental instruments or maybe surgical tools. I tried to focus on the road ahead, on the familiar rhythm of diesel engine and rolling tires, but curiosity gnawed at me like hunger. Around midnight, somewhere in the empty stretch between nowhere and nothing, I reached up and yanked the cloth from the main rearview mirror. Instead of seeing the dark highway behind us, I saw a hospital corridor. The reflection showed gleaming white walls stretching into fluorescent infinity, punctuated by evenly spaced doorways that gaped like mouths. The floor was polished linoleum that reflected the harsh ceiling lights, creating a double image of sterility that made my eyes water. I could smell antiseptic and something else, something organic and warm that didn't belong in that cold space. I blinked hard, shook my head, looked again. Still the corridor, still empty, still wrong. Doc's voice cut through my confusion like a scalpel through skin. He explained, in tones as clinical as the reflected hallway, that mirrors were doorways, that every reflective surface was a potential operating theater where real surgery took place, not on flesh, but on memory, on the accumulated damage that collected in people's minds like scar tissue, making them sick in ways they couldn't understand. He said he was a surgeon of a different kind, that he could see the infections of trauma that festered behind people's eyes, the psychic tumors that grew from untreated emotional wounds. The mirrors, he claimed, allowed him to create sterile spaces where such operations could be performed safely, extracting pain without breaking skin. I wanted to laugh, to dismiss it as the rambling of someone who'd spent too much time alone, but the mirror still showed that impossible corridor, and my hands had started shaking on the steering wheel. Doc noticed, of course. He told me I was sick, that he could see the dark mass of old hurt pressing against my ribs, making it hard to breathe properly. He said I'd been carrying it for years, probably since childhood, and that it was slowly poisoning everything good in my life. The worst part was that he wasn't entirely wrong. There were things I tried not to think about, shadows from a past I'd spent decades trying to outrun. But everyone had those, didn't they? Everyone carried damage. When I refused his offer to help, to perform his bloodless surgery in the reflected operating room, something changed in the cab. The covered mirrors began to show my face anyway, the black cloth somehow becoming transparent from my side. But it wasn't my face as it was. It was my face aging and fast forward, skin sagging and wrinkling, hair turning white and falling out, eyes growing dim and clouded. Every mirror in the truck displayed the same accelerated decay. The side mirrors, the backup camera monitor, even the dark window glass began reflecting my rapid aging back at me. I watched decades pass in minutes, saw myself becoming ancient and brittle while my hands, my real hands, remained unchanged on the steering wheel. Doc sat calmly beside me, occasionally making notes in a small leather journal, as if this were a routine medical consultation. He mentioned that time moved differently in reflective spaces, that the surgery he performed existed outside normal temporal flow. He said I was seeing my future self, the man I would become if I continued carrying my untreated trauma. He offered again to extract it, to remove the emotional cancer that was eating at my years. The aging in the mirrors accelerated. I watched my reflected eyes grow hollow, my cheeks sink inward, my lips become thin and bloodless. My hands in the mirrors became spotted with age, veins standing out like purple cords beneath tissue paper skin. The wine crates behind us seemed to age too, the wood growing gray and brittle, the metal straps rusting before my eyes. I tried closing my eyes, but the images persisted behind my eyelids. Not visual now, but felt, a sensation of my flesh dissolving and reforming, decades of cellular breakdown compressed into heartbeats. My actual body remained unchanged, but the phantom sensation of rapid aging made my bones ache with remembered future pain. Doc opened his satchel and withdrew instruments that gleamed like captured starlight, scalpels and forceps and things I couldn't name, all impossibly clean and sharp. He said the procedure would be quick, that he would simply reach into the reflected operating room and extract the dark growth from my mirror self. He assured me I wouldn't feel any physical pain, that the anesthesia was built into the process. But looking at those instruments, I felt something primal recoil deep in my gut. Surgery was violation, even when necessary. The idea of this strange man reaching into some impossible reflected space to operate on my psyche made my skin crawl with more than fear. It was revulsion at the deepest biological level. The aging continued in every reflective surface, my mirror selves now ancient beyond recognition, barely human shapes dissolving into skeletal frameworks wrapped in translucent skin. The smell of antiseptic grew stronger in the cab, mixed now with something metallic and warm that made my stomach turn. Doc began preparing his instruments, testing their sharpness against the air with movements so precise they seemed choreographed. I realized then that I had no choice, not really. The alternative was to watch myself decay in real time until I became the hollow shell reflected in the mirrors. Doc's surgery might be violation, but it was violation with the promise of healing. The aging was just violation with the promise of death. The highway ahead had become irrelevant. We were traveling through some other space now, some region where mirrors were more real than reality, where reflection took precedence over substance. The wine crates had stopped shifting, as if they too were held in suspension by whatever force governed this impossible surgery. I nodded my consent. Doc's smile was the expression of a man vindicated, a professional whose expertise had finally been recognized. He selected a long, thin instrument from his collection, something between a probe and a needle, designed for precise extraction. As he moved toward the main rearview mirror, his reflection stepped forward to meet him from the other side of the glass. What happened next exists in my memory like a half-remembered dream, vivid but impossible to describe accurately. I felt pressure but no pain, a sense of something being carefully separated from the rest of me and drawn away. In the mirror, Doc's reflected hands worked with impossible delicacy, extracting what looked like dark smoke from my mirror self's chest cavity. The substance writhed and fought as he pulled it free, as if it didn't want to be removed from its host. The aging in the mirrors slowed, then reversed. I watched my reflected selves grow younger, the years flowing backward until they matched my actual appearance. The antiseptic smell faded, replaced by the familiar sense of diesel fuel and highway air. The wine crates resumed their gentle shifting, and the road ahead became just a road again. Doc carefully placed the extracted darkness into a small container from his satchel, sealing it with the reverence of someone handling dangerous medical waste. He told me I would feel different in the coming days, lighter, as if a weight I'd grown accustomed to carrying had been removed. He said the healing would take time, that I might experience some disorientation as my mind adjusted to its newly pristine state. I wanted to ask what he would do with the extracted trauma, where he took the collected darkness of his patients. But before I could form the words, I realized we were pulling into a truck stop outside Reno. The familiar glow of neon signs and fuel pumps seemed impossibly bright after the strange twilight of the surgical highway. Doc gathered his instruments and prepared to leave, but paused at the cab door to offer one final observation. He said that some people were natural carriers of psychic infection, that their unhealed wounds attracted others who were similarly damaged. He suggested I might consider a different line of work, something that didn't involve spending long hours alone with my thoughts on empty highways. Then he was gone, walking into the truck stop's fluorescent interior with his medical satchel clutched against his chest. Just another traveler moving through the night. I sat in the cab for a long time after he left, staring at the uncovered mirrors that now showed only what they should. The truck stop behind me, the dark sky above, my own face looking back with an expression I couldn't quite read. I felt different. He'd been right about that. Lighter, as if some chronic tension had been released from my shoulders and spine. But I also felt empty in a way that scared me. The darkness Doc had extracted hadn't been entirely unwelcome. It had been mine, part of what made me who I was. Without it, I felt like a house with rooms I could no longer remember, spaces that had been surgically sealed away. The wine delivery was completed without incident. The casino accepted the shipment with their usual efficiency, and I began the drive back to California on schedule. But something had changed in the relationship between my eyes and the mirrors, between my mind and the reflected world. Every reflective surface seemed to shimmer with potential, as if it might at any moment reveal some other space, some other impossible truth. I started covering the mirrors myself. 3 months later, I picked up another hitchhiker, a young woman with hollow eyes and a nervous habit of checking her reflection in every available surface. She carried a small makeup compact that she opened and closed compulsively, staring into its mirror with the intensity of someone looking for something specific. As we drove through the Nevada darkness, I found myself watching her in my peripheral vision, noting the way her shoulders hunched forward, as if protecting something in her chest, the way her breathing seemed slightly labored. I began to wonder what Doc would have seen in her, what kind of darkness he might have identified as suitable for extraction. The thought should have disturbed me. Instead, it felt like recognition, the acknowledgement of a skill I hadn't known I possessed. I started paying attention to the mirrors again, looking for corridors that might appear in their depths, listening for the soft clink of instruments that existed somewhere between reflection and reality. The highway stretched ahead, dark and full of possibilities I was only beginning to understand. My passenger checked her compact mirror again, and for just a moment, I thought I saw something else reflected in its surface, something white and sterile, and infinitely welcoming. I began to slow the truck, looking for a place to pull over and have a conversation about surgery. Story 14. The first thing I noticed wasn't the steam rising from under our hood, or Sarah's frustrated sigh beside me, or even the endless rows of corn stretching toward a horizon that seemed to mock our predicament. It was the silence, not the peaceful quiet of rural Kansas that I'd expected, but something deeper, an absence that felt deliberate, almost watchful. I pulled our Civic to the shoulder of the gravel road, the engine's death rattle echoing across the fields before dying completely. The GPS had stopped working 20 miles back, leaving us with nothing but a hand-drawn map from the last gas station and increasingly unfamiliar roads that seemed to lead nowhere. "How far did that guy say the next town was?" Sarah asked, already knowing the answer would offer little comfort. 15 miles, maybe 20. I stepped out, immediately struck by how the heat seemed to press against me from all directions. The air was thick, heavy with the sweet smell of growing corn and something else, something metallic that caught in the back of my throat. That's when I saw them. Scattered throughout the nearest field stood dozens of scarecrows, their forms dark against the green stalks. But these weren't the traditional straw-stuffed guardians I'd grown up seeing in Oklahoma. Each one wore what looked like a mirror where its face should be, the reflective surfaces catching the late afternoon sun and throwing fragments of light in all directions. Sarah joined me at the front of the car, following my gaze. "That's different." The mirrors weren't uniform. Some appeared to be standard household mirrors. Others looked like they'd been salvaged from old medicine cabinets or compacts. A few seemed cracked, their surfaces spider-webbed with fractures that distorted any reflection into grotesque fragments. As I stared, I felt an odd sensation, as if the scarecrows were staring back, though logically I knew that was impossible. "We should start walking," I said, though something in my voice betrayed my reluctance to leave the relative safety of our disabled car. "To where exactly?" Sarah's practical nature had always anchored me, but now her tone carried an edge I wasn't used to hearing. "We haven't seen another car in an hour." A dust cloud on the horizon answered her question. A pickup truck approached, its engine growing louder as it drew closer. I felt relief flood through me, followed immediately by an inexplicable anxiety. The truck slowed, then stopped beside us. The driver was a man in his 60s, with weathered skin and eyes that seemed to hold more knowledge than I was comfortable with. He introduced himself as Bill Morrison, said he lived just up the road in Millfield, a town that hadn't appeared on any of our maps. "Engine trouble?" he asked, though the steam still rising from our hood made the question rhetorical. I explained our situation, grateful for his offer to drive into town for a mechanic, though he warned it might take until morning to get parts. He offered us a place to stay, mentioning that his wife Martha always kept the guest room ready for stranded travelers. "Happens more often than you'd think," he said, his eyes drifting toward the cornfield. "Roads around here can be confusing." As we gathered our overnight bags, I found myself glancing repeatedly at the scarecrows. The sun was beginning to set, casting longer shadows, and I could swear the mirrors were reflecting things that weren't there. Movement, where there should be stillness. Figures where the field stood empty. Millfield wasn't so much a town as a collection of houses clustered around a central area that might generously be called a square. The buildings looked older than they should, as if they'd been weathered by more than just Kansas summers. Bill's house sat at the edge of this cluster, a 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch that offered an unobstructed view of the surrounding cornfields. Martha Morrison greeted us with the kind of hospitality that felt almost aggressive in its warmth. She insisted we join them for dinner, wouldn't hear of us eating alone in our room. The meal was simple but good, pot roast and vegetables from their garden, though I noticed both Bill and Martha kept glancing out the windows as the sun continued to set. "You folks picked an interesting night to visit," Bill said as Martha cleared the plates. "It's a vigil night." "Vigil?" Sarah asked. Martha's smile faltered slightly. "It's a tradition here in Millfield. Every few weeks we gather at sunset to reflect. Helps keep the community together, you might say." "We'd be honored if you'd join us," Bill added, though something in his tone made it sound less like an invitation and more like an expectation. Through the dining room window, I could see lights beginning to flicker in the cornfield, lanterns or flashlights carried by moving figures. The scarecrows stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, their mirrors catching the light and throwing it back in chaotic patterns. "What exactly does this vigil involve?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Bill and Martha exchanged a look. "Well," Bill began slowly, "it's about facing our fears. The mirrors on the scarecrows, they help us reflect on what troubles us, what keeps us awake at night. When we gather around them and truly look at ourselves, really confront what we're afraid of, those fears get absorbed, held, kept away from our homes and families. It's quite beautiful, actually," Martha added. "Very cleansing." Outside, more lights appeared in the field. I could make out dozens of figures moving between the corn rows, each carrying a lantern or flashlight. The effect was hypnotic, like watching fireflies, but there was something deliberate about their movement, almost ritualistic. "And if we choose not to participate?" Sarah asked. I was grateful she'd voiced the question I hadn't quite been able to form. The silence that followed lasted a beat too long. Bill's smile remained, but it seemed to require more effort. "Well, that would be unfortunate. You see, the vigil works because everyone participates. When someone refuses to face their fears, to let the mirrors hold them, those fears tend to linger. They can get trapped in the reflection, become something more substantial." "More substantial how?" My mouth felt dry. "A reflection that carries someone's deepest terrors," Martha explained, her voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality, "can become quite powerful. It might wander, looking for others to share those fears with. Travelers passing through, for instance." I felt Sarah's hand find mine under the table. Her palm was cold, despite the warm evening. "Of course," Bill continued, "if that were to happen, there is a way to set things right. The original mirror, the first one placed on a scarecrow in Millfield, it can release any trapped reflections. But finding it," he shrugged, "well, that would require a deeper understanding of our community than most visitors achieve." Through the window, I watched the lights in the field begin to converge on specific points. The scarecrows, I realized. The figures gathering around each mirrored sentinel were becoming more distinct, and I could see that they were holding objects up to the reflective surfaces. Some appeared to be photographs, others looked like personal items. All the while, they stared into the mirrors with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "The vigil begins at full darkness," Martha said, rising to clear the remaining dishes. "We'll give you a few minutes to decide." Alone in the dining room, Sarah and I whispered urgently about our options. We could try to walk to the next town, but in the dark, on unfamiliar roads, with no guarantee of finding help before morning. We could stay and participate in whatever strange ritual the townspeople practiced, or we could refuse and face the consequences they'd described. "It's just small-town weirdness," Sarah said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Religious communities have all kinds of unusual practices." But even as she spoke, I was watching the scene outside with growing unease. The figures around the scarecrows weren't just looking into the mirrors, they were having conversations with them. I could see their lips moving, their bodies' language shifting between supplication and fear. And in several of the mirrors, I swore I could see movement that didn't match the actions of the people standing before them. One woman, standing before a scarecrow with a badly cracked mirror, suddenly stumbled backward. The others around her reached out to steady her, but their attention remained fixed on the reflective surface. As I watched, the woman's reflection seemed to lag behind her movements, as if the mirror image was fighting to stay in the glass. "We need to get out of here," I whispered. "And go where? Our car's dead, and we don't even know which direction leads to civilization." Before I could respond, Bill returned to the dining room. His earlier warmth had been replaced by something more urgent. "Time to decide, folks. The vigil's starting, and you'll need to choose your scarecrow." "Our scarecrow?" "Each person faces their own reflection, their own fears. We've prepared two for you. They're at the edge of the field, nice and close." He gestured toward the window. "Unless, of course, you'd prefer to wait here." I looked outside again. The scene had grown more intense. Some of the townspeople were now pressed almost against the mirrors, their faces inches from the reflective surfaces. And those mirrors, they were beginning to cloud over, as if something was building up behind the glass. "What happens if we wait here?" Sarah asked. Bill's smile turned sad. "Then your reflections will find you anyway, and without the structure of the vigil, without the community's support, they'll be uncontrolled, harder to manage." As if summoned by his words, I caught sight of movement in the darkened window behind him. My own reflection was there, of course, but for just a moment it seemed to be moving independently, turning its head to look directly at me with an expression I hadn't made. Sarah saw it too. Her grip on my hand tightened. "How do we know you're telling the truth about any of this?" "You don't," Bill admitted. "But look outside. Really look." I did. In the field, several of the mirrors were now completely opaque, their surfaces swirling with what looked like dark smoke. The people standing before them had stepped back, but they were smiling, peaceful expressions of relief. Meanwhile, other mirrors remained clear, their observers still engaged in their strange dialogues with their reflections. And then I saw something that made my breath catch. At the far end of the field, where no lantern light reached, a figure was walking between the corn rows. It moved with an odd, disconnected gait, and even at this distance, I could see that its face was a mirror, reflecting nothing but darkness. "That's what happens when someone refuses," Bill said quietly. "That particular reflection has been wandering our fields for, must be 3 years now. Poor fellow was passing through, much like yourselves. Couldn't bring himself to participate in the vigil." The mirrored figure had stopped walking. Although I couldn't be certain at this distance, it seemed to be facing our house. "The original mirror," I said, my voice hoarse. "You mentioned it could release trapped reflections." "Indeed, though finding it would require you to understand which scarecrow was the first, and why the mirrors were placed there to begin with." Bill moved toward the front door. "The vigil's waiting, folks. I need an answer." Sarah and I exchanged a look. In her eyes, I saw the same terrible certainty that was growing in my mind. Whatever was happening here, we'd moved beyond simple belief or disbelief. The figure in the field had begun walking again, and it was definitely approaching the house. "We'll participate," I said. Bill's relief was palpable. "Excellent. Martha will show you to your scarecrows." The night air was cooler than expected, filled with the sound of whispered conversations and the occasional clink of lantern glass. Martha led us along a worn path between the corn rows, her flashlight creating a small bubble of visibility in the darkness. Other townspeople nodded as we passed, their faces serene in the lantern light. "Here we are," Martha announced, stopping before two scarecrows positioned about 10 feet apart. Each wore clothes that looked like they'd been salvaged from a thrift store, but the mirrors were the focal point. Mine was rectangular, about the size of a bathroom mirror, held in place with wire wrapped around the scarecrow's wooden frame. Sarah's was smaller, round, with an ornate brass frame that suggested it had once been someone's prized possession. "Now," Martha explained, "you'll want to look into your reflection and think about what frightens you most. Not spiders or heights. Those are surface fears. Think deeper. What keeps you awake at night? What would you do anything to avoid facing?" I approached my scarecrow hesitantly. In the mirror, my reflection looked pale and worried, exactly as I felt. But as I stared, trying to identify my deepest fear, the image began to shift subtly. My reflection's expression grew more confident, almost mocking. What frightened me most? The obvious answer was losing Sarah, but as I watched my reflection, I realized that wasn't quite right. My deepest fear was that I was weak, that when faced with a real challenge, I would fail to protect the people I loved, that I would prove myself a coward. My reflection smiled, and its lips moved. I couldn't hear words, but I understood the message. "You're right to be afraid." Around us, the other vigil participants continued their whispered conversations with their mirrors. Some were crying, others looked relieved. A few seemed to be arguing with their reflections, their voices growing more heated. I glanced over at Sarah. She was staring into her mirror with an expression of horror I'd never seen before. Her reflection appeared to be gesturing frantically, and Sarah was shaking her head, tears streaming down her face. "Sarah?" I whispered. She didn't respond. In her mirror, I could see her reflection's mouth moving rapidly, and whatever it was saying was clearly devastating her. That's when I noticed something else. Around the field, some of the mirrors were beginning to darken, just as Bill had described. But instead of the peaceful resolution I'd witnessed from the house, the people standing before these mirrors looked terrified. They were backing away, but their reflections weren't moving with them. One man, standing about 30 feet away, stumbled backward from his scarecrow's mirror, but his reflection remained in the glass, pressing its hands against the surface as if trying to break through. The man himself looked pale, insubstantial, like a photograph that had been left in the sun too long. "Martha," I called out, but when I turned, she was gone. In fact, looking around, I realized that all of the townspeople had vanished. Sarah and I were alone in the field with the scarecrows in their mirrors. "Sarah, we need to go, now." She finally turned to me, and I saw that her eyes were unfocused, almost glassy. "It says it knows a way out," she whispered, "but only if I let it take my place for a while." In her mirror, her reflection was nodding encouragingly. "Don't listen to it," I said, though I wasn't sure why I was so certain this was wrong. "That's not really you." "How do you know?" Her voice carried a dreamy quality that terrified me. "Maybe this is the real me, and what you see is just a reflection." Around us, more mirrors were darkening, and more people were separating from their reflections. The figures left behind looked increasingly translucent, while their mirror-bound selves grew more solid, more real. I grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her away from her scarecrow. Her reflection pounded against the glass, its mouth open in what appeared to be a scream of rage. "We need to find that original mirror," I said. "How? They're all the same." But as I looked around the field, I realized that wasn't quite true. Most of the mirrors were standard household varieties, but scattered among them were older pieces. Antique hand mirrors, vanity mirrors with ornate frames, and a few that looked like they'd been salvaged from old buildings. And then I saw it. At the center of the field, where the most people had gathered earlier, stood a scarecrow with no mirror at all. Instead, where its face should be, there was just an empty wooden frame. The mirror that had once been there lay in pieces at the scarecrow's base, its silvered surface fractured into dozens of sharp fragments. "There," I said, pointing. "The original mirror. It's broken." We ran toward it, passing scarecrows whose mirrors now showed only darkness, or worse, reflections that moved independently, pressing against the glass like prisoners trying to escape. Behind us, I could hear the sound of breaking glass, and when I looked back, I saw that several mirrors had cracked. Dark shapes were seeping out of them, flowing across the ground like liquid shadow. The broken mirror at the base of the central scarecrow was larger than the others, and older. Its frame was wrought iron, intricate and heavy. Among the scattered fragments, I could see partial reflections, pieces of faces, fragments of bodies, all moving independently. "How is this supposed to help?" Sarah asked. She sounded more like herself, as if distance from her scarecrow had broken whatever hold her reflection had been gaining. I knelt among the mirror fragments, and immediately felt a cold sensation, as if the pieces were drawing heat from my skin. In each fragment I could see different images. Some showed the people we'd met tonight, but younger, as if these were reflections from years past. Others showed faces I didn't recognize, men and women who looked terrified, desperate. I think," I said slowly, "that this mirror used to contain all the reflections, all the fears. But when it broke, they scattered to the other mirrors and created more scarecrows to hold them." The sound of breaking glass was getting closer. Around the field, more mirrors were shattering, and the dark shapes pouring from them were beginning to take form, humanoid figures that moved with jerky, unnatural motions. But among the fragments of the original mirror, I noticed something else. Some of the pieces weren't showing reflections at all. They were clear, like ordinary glass, and when I picked one up, I felt warmth instead of cold. "Sarah, help me gather these clear pieces." We worked quickly, collecting fragments that showed no reflections, no trapped images. As we worked, the pieces began to resonate, emitting a soft humming sound that seemed to counter the growing chaos around us. The shadow figures were closer now, and I could see that they were the escaped reflections, distorted versions of people, carrying within them all the fears and terrors that had been fed into the mirrors over the years. They moved toward us with obvious intent, but as we gathered more clear fragments, they seemed to slow, as if walking through increasingly thick air. "What do we do with them?" Sarah asked, holding a handful of the clear glass pieces. I looked up at the empty frame of the original scarecrow. "I think we rebuild it." Working together, we began placing the clear fragments into the frame. They didn't fit perfectly. The original mirror had been a single piece, but as each fragment clicked into place, something remarkable happened. The approaching shadow figures began to slow further, then stop, then slowly dissolve back into wisps of darkness that flowed toward our reconstructed mirror. But it wasn't just the escaped reflections that were being drawn back. All across the field, the darkened mirrors began to clear. The people who had looked translucent and faded began to solidify again, while their trapped reflections flowed out of the mirrors like water, racing across the ground to rejoin their owners. The last piece of clear glass clicked into place, and suddenly the night was silent again. The oppressive weight that had pressed against us all evening lifted, and I could hear normal sounds, crickets, the distant lowing of cattle, wind moving through the corn. Sarah and I stood alone in the field. The scarecrows were still there, but their mirrors now reflected only what stood before them. Corn stalks, night sky, us. Nothing more. "Is it over?" Sarah whispered. I was about to answer when I heard voices approaching. Flashlight beams swung through the corn rows, and soon Bill Morrison emerged with several other people. But these weren't the same townspeople we'd met earlier. They looked confused, disoriented, as if they'd just woken from a long sleep. "What are you folks doing out here?" Bill asked, and I could hear genuine puzzlement in his voice. Your car broke down, right? Martha and I were just coming to tell you that Joe's got his tow truck running. He can pull you into town tonight if you'd like. I looked at Sarah, then back at Bill. His face showed no recognition of our earlier conversation, no memory of vigils or trapped reflections. That would be great, I managed to say. As we walked back toward the lights of town, I glanced over my shoulder at the field. The scarecrows stood motionless, their mirrors catching moonlight and reflecting nothing but the peaceful Kansas night. But at the center of the field, the iron frame we'd rebuilt was empty again, its clear fragments scattered at the base of the scarecrow. Had we imagined it all? Some kind of shared hallucination brought on by stress and unfamiliar surroundings? But then I noticed that Sarah was holding something in her closed fist. When she opened her hand, there was a small piece of clear glass, warm to the touch. We never spoke about that night, not directly, but sometimes when we pass mirrors in our daily lives, I catch Sarah pausing, studying her reflection with an intensity that suggests she's checking for something, making sure that what looks back at her is really her. And sometimes, late at night when sleep won't come, I find myself wondering, in a world where fear can take physical form, where reflections can develop lives of their own, how do you ever really know which side of the mirror you're on? The scarecrows of Millfield still stand in their cornfield, their mirrors reflecting the changing seasons. Travelers still break down on those back roads, still find themselves offered hospitality by people who seem to have no memory of previous visitors. And somewhere among those mirrors, rebuilt or replaced or perhaps never broken at all, the original frame waits, ready to collect whatever terrors people are willing to feed it. But that's just a story I tell myself to make sense of what happened. The rational explanation is that we were exhausted, disoriented by car trouble and unfamiliar surroundings. The mind can play elaborate tricks when stressed. Although sometimes, when I'm shaving in the morning, I notice that my reflection hesitates just a moment before copying my movements. And in that brief delay, I catch a glimpse of an expression that isn't quite mine, one that remembers standing in a cornfield, surrounded by mirrors that reflected more than they should. Those moments pass quickly, of course. Reality reasserts itself, and I finish shaving, brush my teeth, go about my day. But that small piece of glass Sarah kept, she still carries it in her purse, though she's never explained why. Maybe we did imagine it all. Maybe there never was a vigil, never were trapped reflections, never was a broken mirror that needed rebuilding. Maybe Millfield is just another small Kansas town where friendly people help stranded travelers. Nothing more. But every time I consider that possibility, I remember the warmth of that clear glass fragment and the way it hummed with something that felt like truth. And I find myself wondering if the most frightening thing isn't that it happened, but that it might still be happening. That somewhere in Kansas, or perhaps much closer than I'd like to believe, reflections are gathering strength, waiting for the right moment to step through their mirrors and claim the lives they think they deserve. After all, in a world where fear can become real, where does the terror end and the reflection begin?